There was a time when life on Earth came closer to vanishing than at any other moment in its long history. Long before dinosaurs, before flowers, before mammals rose from the shadows, the world of the Permian was rich with strange forests, ancient seas, and powerful synapsid rulers until Earth itself began to change. Volcanoes burned across Siberia, the air warmed, the oceans lost oxygen, and the living planet slowly crossed a threshold. Welcome to Calm Earth Science. Thank you for spending your time here and joining this quiet journey into deep time. If this kind of relaxing science storytelling brings you peace or curiosity, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys Earth's ancient mysteries. And before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Leave a comment below. Now, let us step back into the world of the Great Dying. At the end of the Permian, Earth is not an empty world waiting for disaster. It is a crowded planet, old in its own long way, with forests, deserts, reefs, rivers, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and mammal relatives spread across environments that have been changing for tens of millions of years. The continents have drawn together into the vast landmass of Pangaea, and around it, the global ocean holds communities with roots reaching back toward the earliest chapters of animal life. On land, the ruling creatures are not dinosaurs, and not mammals in the modern sense, but synapsids, the broad branch of life from which mammals will eventually descend. Some carry sails along their backs. Some move with heavy bodies and blunt heads. Some hunt with long canine teeth that make them look strangely familiar across the distance of time. The world is not primitive in any simple way. It is organized, successful, and deeply inhabited. This is what makes its approaching collapse so difficult to hold in the mind. The Great Dying is not the fall of a sparse beginning. It is the near erasure of a mature biosphere, a living inheritance built across roughly 200 million years of Paleozoic evolution. By the time the crisis begins, life has already survived ice ages, shifting seas, continental collisions, oxygen changes, and earlier extinctions. The flame has narrowed more than once, yet it has remained lit. Complex animals have filled shallow seas, colonized the land, entered the air, and built food webs so established that they can seem almost permanent when viewed from within their own moment. But permanence is one of deep time's gentlest illusions. A world can look stable because its changes are too slow for any single creature to witness, while beneath that appearance, its systems are held together by balances that can fail. The late Permian Earth carries several of those balances at once. Its continents are joined in a way that changes rainfall and wind. Its interiors are broad and dry. Its seas are vulnerable to changes in oxygen and chemistry. Its ecosystems include long-lived lineages, but also dependencies that tie plants, animals, soils, atmosphere, and ocean together in one fragile exchange. Nothing about this world needs to be weak in order to be vulnerable. Its strength lies in connection, and that connection becomes the path through which disturbance can travel. A forest can feed herbivores, shelter small animals, hold soil, draw carbon from the air, and influence the water that moves through the landscape. A climate system can remain livable not because it is still, but because its moving parts keep one another within limits. The late Permian is a planet of such limits. It is alive inside them, and approaching the edge of them. In the dry regions of Pangaea, survival already requires adaptation to heat, drought, and seasonal stress. This does not mean the land is barren everywhere. Coastal lowlands, river systems, upland basins, and more humid zones still hold living communities. But the single supercontinent has altered the texture of the world. Temperatures can swing more sharply across land than across water. The Permian landscape is therefore not a simple paradise interrupted by catastrophe. It is a varied, demanding Earth where many organisms have become successful by fitting themselves to pressure. The synapsids are among the clearest signs of that success. They have taken the vertebrate experiment on land and expanded it into large herbivores, active predators, burrowers, and smaller forms moving beneath the attention of giants. Their skulls, teeth, and postures record a world in transition, not yet mammalian, but already moving away from the older shapes of amphibian-dominated ecosystems. In them, the future seems to be gathering quietly, yet deep time does not protect a lineage because it seems promising. The history of life is not a ladder that safely carries each important branch upward. It is a field of experiments, some of them brilliant, many of them temporary, all of them exposed to the wider behavior of the planet. Before the end arrives, the land belongs largely to creatures whose descendants, or near relatives, will not remain rulers for long. Gorgonopsids, with their powerful bodies and saber-like teeth, occupy roles that later animals will reinvent in different forms. Decenodont, with their beaked mouths and tusks, graze and browse through the Permian world in shapes unlike most living herbivores. Large amphibians still linger near water, carrying the memory of earlier carboniferous wetlands. Insects move through vegetation, some belonging to lineages that will not cross the boundary ahead. Around them, plants form the base of the terrestrial web, quieter than the animals but more essential than any predator. They turn sunlight into food. They hold ground in place. They regulate the exchange between air and living tissue. Their disappearance in any region is not only the loss of greenery, it is the failure of a foundation. Offshore, another inheritance continues. Trilobites still crawl the seabed after surviving from deep in the Paleozoic. Brachiopods filter seawater from their shells. Crinoids lift feather-like arms into the currents. Corals and other reef builders shape hard structures that make homes for smaller organisms. Ammonoid relatives turn through the water with coiled shells, while fish and shark-like forms move through marine systems that have their own hierarchies and risks. The oceans may appear wider and more forgiving than the land, but their life is bound to invisible conditions. Dissolved oxygen, acidity, temperature, nutrient flow, and circulation all matter. A sea can look open and endless while becoming hostile in its chemistry. The late Permian Ocean, like the land, holds abundance inside constraints. Its creatures do not need to understand those constraints. They only need them to remain within the narrow range where bodies can build shells, breathe through gills, grow, reproduce, and repair. That narrowness is easy to miss from the surface of the story. Mass extinction often becomes a number, a percentage, a dark statistic placed between geological periods. But before any number can be counted, extinction is lived as the breaking of ordinary continuity. A breeding ground fails, a shoreline changes, a forest thins, a reef stops building faster than it erodes, a predator finds fewer prey. A species survives in one basin but disappears from another, generation after generation. The familiar world becomes less reliable, until rarity replaces abundance and absence becomes a pattern in stone. The Great Dying will later be recognized as the most severe mass extinction in the known history of complex life, with losses that reach across land and sea more deeply than any other crisis. But at the beginning, there is no single moment when Earth announces such a fate. There is only a living world, impressive and intricate, moving through stresses that become harder to absorb. This distinction matters because the end-Permian crisis is not best understood as one clean blow from outside. Like the later impact associated with the end of the non-avian dinosaurs, the Great Dying unfolds through Earth's own systems, through volcanic release, atmospheric change, ocean chemistry, warming, oxygen loss, and ecological unraveling. Its danger lies partly in duration. A sudden disaster can destroy with violence, but a long disturbance can alter the rules by which survival works. It can make yesterday's adaptations insufficient. It can turn food webs into traps, because each surviving creature depends on other living things that may already be failing. It can move through the air before it reaches the soil, through the ocean before it reaches the reef, through climate before it reaches the nest, the egg, the burrow, or the shell. When viewed this way, the late Permian is not merely a stage before catastrophe. It is the system that catastrophe will use. Every thriving connection becomes a possible line of transmission. Every specialized body becomes a question. Every successful ecosystem carries within it an assumption that the surrounding world will remain recognizable enough for success to continue. The Paleozoic has seen life rise from marine beginnings into forests, swamps, deserts, rivers, and skies. It has produced strange arthropods, armored fishes, early land plants, amphibians, reptiles, synapsids, and countless marine animals whose forms are preserved only in broken shells and mineral traces. It has made Earth rich with complexity. At the edge of the Triassic, that richness becomes the measure of what can be lost. The approaching extinction is therefore not only a story of death, it is a story of scale, of how much life had already achieved before the planet's balances shifted beyond recognition. In the rocks that remain, the evidence is quiet. There is no sound of forests failing, no visible movement of poisoned air, no memory of individual animals looking for water, shade, prey, or shelter. There are only layers, fossils, chemical signals, vanished lineages, and abrupt changes in what appears above and below a boundary. Yet from those remains, a wider image can be reconstructed. A full world stood at the threshold. Not knowing it was a threshold, the old Paleozoic order still carried its forests and reefs, its synapsid rulers and seafloor survivors, its predators and grazers, its shells and spores and river mud. It had no reason to understand itself as fragile. Fragility often becomes clear only after the support has been removed. The next movement begins beneath Siberia, where heat and pressure open a path from Earth's interior to its surface, and where the slow violence of volcanic rock begins to change the fate of nearly everything alive. Before the Siberian eruptions can be understood as a planetary force, the shape of the world around them has to come into view. Late Permian Earth is gathered into Pangaea, a supercontinent so broad that distance from the sea becomes one of its defining conditions. Along its coasts, oceans still soften temperatures and bring moisture inland. But across the interior, the influence of water fades. Air masses travel over enormous stretches of land. Rainfall weakens. Seasonal contrasts grow sharper. Heat can settle across basins, and cold can return with a severity that smaller continents might have moderated. The land is not uniformly dead or empty, but it is unevenly generous. Life is pressed into river corridors, uplands, coastal margins, floodplains, and regional refuges where water and vegetation remain dependable enough to support food webs. Between those living zones, dry country expands. This geography matters because it changes what it means to survive. In a fragmented world of separate continents, climate stress can differ from place to place, and living things may find escape routes through varied environments. On a single immense landmass, the same broad pressures can extend farther, binding distant habitats into one climatic pattern. Pangaea does not cause the great dying by itself, but it prepares a stage on which disturbance can travel widely, and on which resilience may already be unevenly distributed. The Permian begins after the swampy richness of the Carboniferous has receded. Earlier forests had spread across humid lowlands, laying down plant matter that would one day become coal, and sheltering amphibians, early land vertebrates, and giant arthropods in landscapes thick with moisture. The later Permian reverses much of that older world. As continents join and mountains rise along collision zones, patterns of rain and wind reorganize. Interior basins become more isolated from marine humidity. Evaporation exceeds rainfall in many places. Red beds, salt deposits, wind-shaped sandstones, and dryland sediments record environments where water is present only seasonally or only in particular channels. These rocks are evidence of a planet whose surface is changing the terms of life. A creature adapted to a wet forest does not simply move into such country and continue unchanged. Eggs, skin, breathing, movement, burrowing, DEET, and heat tolerance all become part of the test. The animals that succeed are those able to carry life farther from permanent water, or to use dry landscapes without being destroyed by them. In this sense, Pangaea is a filter. It does not choose with intention, but it sorts bodies by what they can endure. Amphibians, still tied more closely to water, no longer own the land as they had in older wet worlds. Reptile relatives and synapsids gain space, partly because their reproductive strategies are better suited to dry ground. The amniotic egg, protected by membranes and laid away from open water, changes the reach of vertebrate life. It allows lineages to occupy places that would have been risky for animals whose eggs needed ponds and marshes. That single biological innovation does not explain the whole Permian, but it helps reveal why the land animals of this time look so different from those of the Carboniferous. Dryness opens some doors while closing others. The result is not decline at first, but replacement, expansion, and a new ecological grammar shaped by drought and distance. Within that grammar, the great interior of Pangaea develops a particular severity. Far from shore, daily and seasonal swings can be stronger. Plants face not only a lack of water, but also the difficulty of maintaining soils under heat and periodic dryness. When vegetation thins, erosion can increase. When erosion increases, habitats become less stable. Rivers may still braid through basins and flood after rains, but the reliability of those systems can change from year to year. Animals living in such regions depend on a patchwork of resources. Herbivores follow edible plants through shifting seasons. Predators follow herbivores. Smaller creatures seek shade. Burrows, roots, damp soil, or the margins of streams. The landscape becomes a map of temporary tolerances. What appears as open land in the fossil record may have contained many subtle refuges. But each refuge depends on climate behaving within certain bounds. Push the system moderately, and some organisms may adjust. Push it repeatedly or for too long, and the patchwork begins to fail. This is the quiet importance of Pangaea. It creates not only heat and dryness, but scale. The distances are so great that recovery from local damage may be slower. Dispersal may be harder for some animals, and regional collapse may remove entire corridors of survival. The supercontinent also alters the seas around it. Coastlines change in length and shape. Shallow marine habitats, among the richest places for Paleozoic life, are affected by sea level, continental shelves, and the arrangement of basins. Many shell builders, reef organisms, and bottom dwellers flourish in such settings, but their richness comes with sensitivity. Changes in temperature, oxygen, nutrients, and acidity reach them quickly. The same continental arrangement that stresses the land can shape the ocean's vulnerability. Rivers carry sediment and dissolved material from the interior. Winds move dust. Climate influences circulation. The line between land and sea is therefore not a boundary between separate stories. It is a seam through which stress can pass. A drying continent can change what reaches the coast. A warming atmosphere can change how the ocean stores oxygen. Damaged plant cover can change erosion, river chemistry, and nutrient flow, long before the final extinction is counted. The physical design of the planet has linked its systems together. Pangaea's deserts and dry basins also help explain why the animals of the Permian should not be imagined as living in a single uniform landscape. The same age can contain scrubby lowlands, riverine forests, upland communities, seasonal floodplains, salt flats, dune fields, and coastal habitats. In some regions, life may appear stable. In others, it may already be close to its limits. This unevenness is essential. Because mass extinction rarely strikes a perfectly equal world. It finds some groups exposed and others sheltered, some regions declining earlier and others remaining habitable longer. The fossil record preserves part of this unevenness in basins where sediment buried bones, leaves, shells, burrows, or footprints. It shows animals adapted to the new order of dry land, but also hints at the narrowness of that success. A dominant lineage can fill many roles without being safe. A landscape can hold large herbivores and predators without being resistant to planetary change. The late Permian world is therefore both accomplished and precarious. The continental interior does not need to be lifeless to be dangerous. It only needs to be close enough to drought, heat, and ecological thinning that an additional forcing can push it beyond repair. The formation of Pangaea is itself a deep process. Older than the final extinction, continents do not collide in a single movement. They converge across immense spans of time, closing oceans, raising mountains, suturing crust, and rearranging the pathways of atmosphere and sea. By the late Permian, that work has produced a world whose geography would be unrecognizable from the modern map. There is no Atlantic Ocean dividing familiar continents. Many future coastlines are buried inside the joined mass. What will one day be separate, lands are locked together, and the planet's circulation responds to that union. Monsoon patterns may form along some margins, while interiors remain dry. Mountains cast rain shadows. Basins trap heat. The result is a living Earth shaped by its own assembly. This is one of the calmer but more profound lessons of deep time. The arrangement of rock can guide the fate of flesh. Life is not spread over geology like decoration. It is entangled with it. That entanglement gives the late Permian its particular tension. The biosphere is not waiting passively above an inert planet. It is living on a surface that is still being made and remade by tectonics, erosion, volcanism, climate, and ocean circulation. Pangaea concentrates many of those processes into a stark global pattern. It gives Earth large deserts, strong climatic gradients, altered seas, and broad ecological provinces where similar pressures can extend across great distances. For millions of years, life works within this pattern. Synapsids diversify. Plants persist where they can. Insects, amphibians, reptiles, and marine invertebrates continue their own histories. The system is demanding, but not yet broken. Its living forms are proof that pressure and success can coexist. Yet that coexistence can be mistaken for security. A harsh world may support life well enough until the harshness intensifies. A dry interior may be survivable until heat rises. Rainfall shifts, vegetation fails, and food webs begin to lose their anchors. A coastline may be rich until the ocean beyond it warms and loses oxygen. This is why the geography of Pangaea belongs near the beginning of the Great Dying story. It is not the spark, but it helps explain the kind of world the spark enters. The great landmass has made Earth spacious, severe, and internally linked. When the volcanic province in Siberia begins to pour out lava and gases on a scale almost beyond ordinary comparison, those emissions do not enter a neutral world. They enter a world whose dry interiors, altered coastlines, and strained climate patterns have already made survival a matter of balance. The shape of Pangaea is the quiet architecture beneath the catastrophe. And once that architecture is seen, the coming collapse no longer feels like a disaster falling onto life from nowhere. It feels like pressure finding every path that the planet had already prepared. The rulers of the Permian land are easy to misplace in the imagination because they do not fit neatly into the familiar order that comes later. They are not dinosaurs, because dinosaurs have not yet risen. They are not reptiles in the ordinary modern sense, because their deeper branch points toward mammals. They are synapsids, animals marked in the bones of the skull by a single opening behind the eye, and by a strange place between early land vertebrates and the warmer, furred animals that will one day descend from their smaller survivors. In the Permian, however, they are not a hidden lineage waiting in the margins. They are the main vertebrate presence across many terrestrial ecosystems. Their bodies move through dry basins, river valleys, floodplains, and upland habitats as herbivores, predators, burrowers, and heavy-bodied grazers. Some look distant and unfamiliar, with broad skulls, sprawling limbs, and sails of bone rising above their backs. Others carry hints of a future that has not yet arrived, in teeth that divide the work of cutting and gripping, in jaw muscles that reshape the skull, and perhaps in coverings that begin to blur the old boundary between naked reptile-like skin and mammalian insulation. The Permian is, in this sense, a synapsid world, and its collapse will be more than a general ecological disaster. It will be the fall of a long experiment in mammal line dominance before mammals themselves truly exist. The earliest famous forms are often grouped informally as pelycosaurs, though that name gathers several lineages rather than one neat natural family. Their most recognizable feature is the tall sail carried by animals such as Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus, a structure built from lengthened spines rising from the backbone. The sail has often been imagined as a device for managing body heat, though the living reality was likely more complicated, involving display, species recognition, physiology, and behavior as well as temperature. What matters for the story is not only the sail itself, but what it shows about the early Permian land. These animals are large, conspicuous, and specialized. They are not tentative visitors to the dry world. Dimetrodon, often mistaken for a dinosaur in popular memory, belongs far closer to the mammal line and stands as one of the major predators of its time. Edaphosaurus, with a different skull and tooth arrangement, represents herbivory within the same broader landscape of experimentation. Already, the synapsids are filling roles that require large bodies, stable food sources, and enough ecological complexity to support predators above plant eaters. Their success implies a land system that, despite dryness and stress, still has structure. Later in the Permian, other synapsids replace many of these sail-backed forms, and the dominant shapes of terrestrial life change again. Among the most striking are the dinocephalians, a name meaning terrible heads. Though the phrase captures only part of their diversity, they include massive herbivores and formidable carnivores, some with thickened skull roofs and heavy bodies, some with forms suggesting pushing, display, soar, combat, and others adapted to feeding on vegetation at a scale that earlier terrestrial ecosystems had rarely supported. Their skulls are often broad, reinforced, and strange in detail, as if the Permian were testing how many ways a head could become an instrument of survival. In them, the synapsid rise becomes almost architectural. Bone thickens, bodies enlarge. Food webs hold animals among the largest land vertebrates of their age. These creatures do not give the impression of a marginal branch. They are central, abundant in some deposits, and ecologically varied, yet they too are temporary. By late Permian time, many dinocephalians have disappeared, and the leading roles pass to other synapsids whose names carry a quieter significance for the future. The first of these late Permian powers are the gorgonopsians, predators with long skulls, deep jaws, and enlarged canine teeth. Their resemblance to later saber-toothed mammals is convergence, the repeated discovery that long, piercing teeth can serve a predator built for seizing flesh. A gorgonopsian skull makes the Permian feel less remote for a moment, because its weapons echo forms that will return much later among mammalian carnivores. Yet the rest of the animal remains from another world. The limbs, posture, yuff, and brain case remain far from modern cats or wolves. These hunters stalk ecosystems where their prey may include dicynodonts, paraosaurs, smaller synapsids, and other animals that share a landscape already shaped by heat, drought, and seasonal change. Their dominance suggests power, but it also creates dependence. A large predator is never secure by its teeth alone. It requires prey, and prey require plants, soils, water, and the regularity of growth. In a stable food web, the Gorgonopsian is a summit. In a failing one, it becomes exposed at the top of a narrowing pyramid. Beside them are the dicynodonts, one of the great herbivorous successes of the late Permian. Their name refers to two dog-like teeth, but many forms are better recognized by their beaked jaws and tusks. Some are small and squat, while others are barrel-bodied animals built for tough vegetation. They appear across broad regions, suggesting resilience before the crisis. In Dicynodont, the mammal line explores a very different path from the Gorgonopsian blade. Here, the problem is not how to kill large prey, but how to turn plants into body mass in a dry and changing world. Beaks crop food. Jaw muscles work against resistant stems and leaves. Tusks may help with display, digging, combat, or foraging, depending on the species. Their success matters because it helps show how complete the synapsid world has become. It contains not merely hunters, but the plant-eating foundations needed to sustain hunters. It contains small forms and large ones, specialized skulls and widespread generalists. Animals fitted to basins that now lie across several continents, once joined in Permian land. Their fossils do not preserve a single kingdom, but many regional communities tied together by ancestry, climate, and the shared architecture of Pangaea. Another late Permian group, the Therocephalians, occupies a more varied and often less famous place in the same story. Some are carnivorous, some may have been omnivorous, and some move closer to later mammal-like biology, along with the cynodonts, which will become crucial after the extinction. They belong to a more derived branch of synapsids called therapsids. In these animals, the body begins to reorganize in ways that matter deeply over long time. Teeth become more differentiated. Limbs begin to draw inward, compared with more sprawling older forms. The jaw and skull change in ways that will eventually lead, through many intermediate steps, toward the mammalian middle ear and chewing system. The Permian synapsid world is therefore not just a gallery of lost monsters, it is a moving laboratory of anatomy. Some experiments end entirely, some narrow almost to nothing. A few pass through the boundary and continue in altered form. What makes the Great Dying so severe for this story is that it does not merely trim away weak lineages, it removes dominant, complex, successful ones. The Gorgonopsians vanish. Many large herbivorous forms disappear. The old balance of predator and prey breaks apart. If synapsids had been viewed from within the late Permian, they might have seemed like the obvious future of land vertebrates. Their diversity, size, and ecological reach all pointed toward continued rule. Deep time, however, is full of futures that appear obvious only until the conditions supporting them change. The synapsids had prospered in the dry world that followed the Carboniferous, but their success was tied to the living systems around them. When climate, plants, soils, and prey communities began to fail, dominance became a liability as well as an achievement. Large bodies need food. Specialized predators need stable prey. Herbivores need vegetation through harsh seasons. And complex communities need continuity. The late Permian synapsids were magnificent precisely because they were embedded in such continuity. And that is why their decline marks such a deep break. The extinction ahead will not erase the synapsid line completely. That survival is essential, because without it there will be no mammals, no later primates, and no human witness to reconstruct the loss. But survival will come through reduced, durable, often smaller forms, not through the great rulers of the old world. The branch will pass forward as a remnant rather than as a reigning power. This reversal is one of the quiet tragedies of the Permian. A lineage that once dominated the land will enter the Triassic diminished, while other branches, especially diapsid reptiles and archosaurs, find opportunities in the emptied spaces. Before that change can unfold, the synapsid world should be seen in its fullness, not as a failed prelude to mammals, but as a complete terrestrial order with its own predators, herbivores, experiments, and pressures. Its animals carried the past of early land vertebrates and the first hints of a distant mammalian future. They moved across a supercontinent that made dryness ordinary and resilience necessary. They ruled before the dinosaurs, before the first true mammals, before flowers, before birds, before grasslands, and before nearly every familiar surface of the modern world. Then the foundations under them began to shift. The disaster that follows does not simply remove strange animals from a remote chapter. It interrupts a possible age of synapsids, leaving only a narrow thread to continue through the wreckage. The Permian Ocean carries a memory older than almost anything moving on land. Long before synapsids hunt across dry basins, long before Pangea gathers the continents into one vast body, marine animals have already spent hundreds of millions of years building, feeding, crawling, filtering, burrowing, and dying beneath changing seas. The ocean is where complex animal life first becomes abundant in the fossil record, and by the late Permian it is filled with lineages that seem, from a human distance, almost impossibly persistent. Trilobites still move across the seafloor, though their greatest age lies far behind them. Brachiopods open their shells to passing currents. Crinoids lift feathery arms from stalked bodies like living traces of an older marine architecture. Corals and sponges help form reef communities, while ammonoids coil through the water in shells that record growth as a spiral of chambers. Sharks and other fishes occupy the open water and the margins of the seabed, including strange forms such as Helicoprion, whose tooth whorl remains one of the more unsettling designs preserved from the Paleozoic sea. This is not an ocean at the beginning of invention. It is an ocean dense with inheritance. Some of its inhabitants have survived previous crises. Some have watched, in the blind patience of evolution. As continents moved, climates shifted, and other groups rose and vanished. Their presence gives the late Permian Sea a deceptive quality. It feels ancient enough to be secure. Yet the very groups that seem most durable will soon reveal how narrow durability can become when the water itself changes. A marine ecosystem can look stable because its animals are familiar across geological time, but no shell, stalk, limb, or gill carries immunity against a collapsing environment. The seafloor communities of the Permian are built on quiet exchanges. Water moves over feeding structures. Tiny particles are caught, sorted, swallowed, or rejected. Shells grow by drawing minerals from seawater. Burrows open the sediment. Reefs lift hard frameworks into places where smaller life can shelter. Predators search among these structures, and scavengers return dead tissue to the cycle. Much of this work is slow and nearly invisible, but it creates richness. A brachiopod bed is not only a gathering of shells, it is a living surface where current, food, chemistry, competition, and reproduction all meet. A reef is not merely stone made by organisms. It is a habitat that depends on water warm enough, clear enough, oxygenated enough, and chemically suitable enough for its builders to keep adding to it. The old Paleozoic ocean is therefore not simple abundance. It is abundance under rules. The animals do not make those rules. They inherit them from the physical sea. Temperature, dissolved oxygen, acidity, salinity, nutrients, and circulation decide what kinds of bodies can keep working. A stronger change can spread through every layer of the community, beginning with organisms that build shells or require steady oxygen, and then reaching the creatures that feed on them. Among the most enduring symbols of that older world are the trilobites. By the late Permian, they are no longer the dominant marvels of the early Paleozoic. When their many forms occupied seafloor niches across much of the planet, their diversity has already narrowed, and their remaining lineages persist as survivors rather than as rulers. Still, their continued presence matters. They carry the Cambrian past into the last chapter of the Paleozoic, a living connection to the first great flowering of animal complexity. For an immense span of time, trilobites have endured enough to remain recognizable across worlds that changed around them. The end-Permian crisis will finally remove them completely. That disappearance is not only the extinction of a group, it is the closing of an evolutionary record that had run almost from the beginning of complex animal abundance. When trilobites vanish, the Paleozoic loses one of its signature forms. Brachiopods also give the Permian Sea much of its character. At a glance, they can resemble clams, but their anatomy and evolutionary history are different. Many lie fixed to the seafloor, filtering particles from the water, thriving where currents bring food reliably across their shells. In many Paleozoic communities, they are extraordinarily common, forming dense accumulations that later turn into fossil beds. Their success depends on conditions that allow shell growth and steady feeding. When seawater chemistry shifts, when oxygen declines, when sediment smothers the bottom, or when food supply alters, brachiopod communities record the disturbance in survival. Scissor, diversity, and disappearance. Crinoids show a different version of the same dependence, often called sea lilies, though they are animals related to starfish and sea urchins. They raise branching arms into the current and gather food from passing water. Their bodies are made of many small plates, and after death those plates can scatter into sediment, leaving thick deposits of broken skeletal pieces. A living crinoid meadow gives the seafloor height and texture. It turns current into nutrition. But crinoids, too, rely on water that can sustain respiration and skeleton building. In a sea, losing oxygen or changing chemistry, the elegance of their feeding becomes a liability. The animals are tied to place, tied to flow, tied to the quiet constancy of conditions that may fail from below before danger can be seen from above. Reefs add another layer to this old ocean. Permian reefs are not identical to modern coral reefs, though corals are part of the story. Sponges, algae, microbial communities, and other organisms also help build or bind carbonate structures. These reefs create habitat in a world where three-dimensional space is precious. Crevices, hard surfaces, shaded pockets, and exposed feeding positions allow many organisms to live close together. Yet reefs are among the clearest examples of how life can become strong by building upward and fragile by depending on the water around the structure. Reef builders need chemical conditions that allow calcium carbonate to form rather than dissolve. They need oxygenated water. They need the surrounding environment to remain within limits long enough for growth to outpace erosion and breakage. When those limits fail, a reef does not only lose its builders, it loses the community arranged around the builders. It removes shelter, feeding grounds, nursery spaces, and hard surfaces from the marine world. The open water holds its own strangeness. Ammonoids, relatives of later ammonites, move through the Permian seas with coiled shells divided into chambers. They are active, widespread, and useful to geologists because their rapid evolution and broad distribution can help mark time in marine rocks. In the late Permian, some ammonoid groups remained successful, but their fortunes are tied to the same environmental threads as the rest of the ocean. Warming water holds less dissolved oxygen. Stagnant basins can become hostile from the bottom upward. Acidifying seawater makes shell formation more costly and can weaken the chemistry on which many hard-bodied organisms depend. A coiled shell is a beautiful adaptation only while the sea remains suitable for making and maintaining it. Fishes and shark relatives add motion and predation to this setting. Acanthodians, sometimes called spiny sharks, though they are not true sharks in the modern sense, continue as part of the Paleozoic fish fauna. Helicoprion, with its spiral tooth arrangement, suggests how experimental marine predators could be. Even this late in the era, these animals remind the Permian Ocean is not merely a floor of shells and filter feeders. It is a vertical environment, with swimmers, hunters, scavengers, and prey moving through different depths and along different margins. Yet active animals also need oxygen, food, and stable reproductive settings. They depend indirectly on planktonic life, seafloor communities, and the chemistry that shapes every breath drawn through gills. The more complete the ecosystem appears, the more routes there are for disruption to spread. If bottom waters lose oxygen, seafloor communities suffer. If shell builders decline, predators and grazers lose structure and food. If warming alters circulation, entire basins can change in character. The ocean's connectivity becomes a source of exposure. What happens in chemistry does not remain chemical for long. It becomes ecological. It becomes anatomical. It becomes extinction. The late Permian seas, then, should not be imagined as passive victims waiting beneath a separate land catastrophe. They are full participants in the planetary system, linked to atmosphere, rivers, volcanic gases, weathering, carbon exchange, and climate. Their life is abundant, but much of it is exquisitely tuned. The same currents that deliver food can deliver low-oxygen water. The same chemistry that permits shell growth can shift toward dissolution. The same broad continental arrangement that shapes shallow seas can limit circulation in ways that make stagnation more likely. A marine animal cannot flee the chemistry of the water in which its body is immersed. It may move from one basin to another, from one depth to another, from reef to open bottom, but it remains inside the ocean's changing envelope. In the end-Permian crisis, that envelope becomes the central danger. The oldest survivors of the Paleozoic Sea are not defeated because they are poorly made. They are defeated because the world they are made for begins to disappear around them. Before the dying reaches its greatest force, these oceans still carry their ancient forms, their shellbeds, reefs, coiled swimmers, stalked filter feeders, and bottom-crawling relics. They hold a long memory of life's early expansion. But memory is not protection. The sea has preserved the past for hundreds of millions of years, and it is precisely here, among the oldest witnesses, that the coming extinction will cut most deeply. The warning before the final collapse does not appear as a single mark in the rocks. It appears as unease spread across time, as earlier losses, unstable climates, shifting oceans, and ecosystems that may already have been less resilient than they looked. Several million years before the end-Permian crisis, Earth passes through the Capetanian extinction, a middle Permian disturbance that remains harder to explain than the Great Dying itself. But important because it shows that the biosphere was not moving calmly from strength into sudden ruin. The late Paleozoic world had already been tested. Some reef systems declined. Some marine invertebrate groups suffered. Some land communities changed. The event does not empty the planet in the way the final crisis will. Yet it leaves a signal strong enough to suggest that life had recently endured a serious shock. That matters because recovery from extinction is not simply the return of surviving names to a fossil list. Recovery means the rebuilding of food webs, the restoration of ecological variety, the return of stable habitats, and the reoccupation of roles that were opened by loss. If another great disturbance arrives before those processes are complete, the living world may meet it with fewer buffers. The Great Dying therefore begins, in a deeper sense, before its most destructive phase. It begins in a biosphere that has already learned how unstable the Permian can be, and perhaps has not fully regained the complexity needed to absorb what comes next. The Capetanian crisis sits in the middle of the Permian like a partial rehearsal, not because it follows the same script in every detail, but because it exposes the planet's sensitivity to linked changes in volcanism, climate, sea level, and ocean chemistry. Some research has connected this earlier extinction to major volcanic activity in what is now southern China, where the Yimeishan large igneous province poured out vast amounts of lava. A large igneous province is not an ordinary volcanic field. It is a region where enormous volumes of molten rock reach the surface or intrude into the crust, often over geologically short intervals. and often with consequences that extend beyond the place of eruption. Such eruptions can release carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, halogens, and other gases capable of altering climate and chemistry. They can warm the planet, darken skies for intervals, acidify rain, disturb oceans, and force living systems to respond to more than one stress at once. The exact role of the Shan eruptions remains debated, and the Capetanian extinction itself is still being refined as new fossils and chemical records are studied. But its presence in the story gives the Permian a pattern. This is not a period in which the final catastrophe erupts out of perfect calm. It is a world in which deep earth processes may already have pressed life hard enough to leave scars. That earlier pressure also clarifies the difference between extinction as an event and extinction as a condition. In ordinary language, an extinction event sounds like a moment. In deep time, it may be a long interval during which birth rates, death rates, habitat ranges, and environmental limits shift until entire lineages can no longer maintain themselves. A species may survive the first pulse of stress, only to lose the conditions needed for stable reproduction. A reef may persist in fragments, while no longer rebuilding strongly enough to recover after storms or sediment flows. A predator lineage may remain present, but with fewer prey species beneath it. Plants may survive in refuges, while landscapes between those refuges become drier, more eroded, or less connected. The fossil record often compresses such struggles into boundaries and percentages, but the living process would have been gradual, uneven, and regional. The Capetanian disturbance reminds the later story to be read with this patience. A biosphere can be wounded without being destroyed. It can look alive because many organisms remain, while its deeper structure has become easier to break. On land, this may have meant communities already shifting before the final Permian extinction began. The Middle and Late Permian do not hold a single unchanging caste of animals. Dinocephalians rise and then vanish before the end of the period. Other therapsids, including dicenodonts, gorgonopsians, therocephalians, and cynodont, become more prominent in different regions and intervals. Some of this turnover belongs to ordinary evolutionary change, the long replacement of one set of successful forms by another, but some may reflect environmental instability, habitat reorganization, or extinction pulses that removed earlier groups and opened space for later ones. The difficulty is that the land record is uneven. Fossils form where sediment buries bodies under the right conditions, not wherever animals lived. Some apparent disappearances may reflect missing rock or poor sampling. Others record real biological loss. The uncertainty does not weaken the story, it makes it more careful. The late Permian terrestrial world is not a simple still image of synapsid abundance. It is a sequence of changing communities, some recovering, some expanding, some already narrowed, all exposed to a climate system shaped by Pangea and increasingly vulnerable to further disturbance. The oceans carry their own warning signs. Marine extinction before the final boundary suggests that some communities were already stressed by changes in temperature, oxygen, sea level, or chemistry. Reef decline is especially important because reefs concentrate biological complexity. When reefs weaken, the loss is not only the loss of builders, it is the reduction of habitat for organisms that depend on the reef's hard surfaces, cavities, and currents. Brachiopods, corals, sponges, ammonoids, and other marine groups respond differently to stress, but many share dependence on oxygenated water and chemical conditions that permit shell or skeleton formation. If earlier Permian disturbances had already reduced diversity in some habitats, then later global warming and ocean oxygen loss would fall on communities with fewer alternative forms and less ecological redundancy. Redundancy is not waste in a living system, it is insurance. When several species perform similar roles in different ways, the loss of one may not immediately collapse the function. When diversity narrows, the same loss becomes more dangerous. A reef with fewer builders, a food web with fewer prey types, or a sea floor with fewer burrowing animals may continue for a time, but its ability to absorb the next disturbance is diminished. This is one reason the Great Dying becomes so severe. It does not strike a biosphere made invulnerable by age. It strikes one whose earlier complexity may already have been trimmed by prior crises. Climate itself may have been unstable before the final volcanic pulse. The Permian includes intervals of icehouse conditions inherited from earlier late Paleozoic glaciations, followed by warmer and drier climates as continental arrangements and atmospheric carbon levels changed. The transition from cooler worlds with large ice sheets to warmer greenhouse conditions alters sea levels, weathering, rainfall, and habitats. No organism experiences this as climate in the abstract. A plant experiences it as water stress, heat tolerance, growing season, soil chemistry, and competition. A marine animal experiences it as temperature, oxygen, carbonate availability, and the movement of food through water. A land vertebrate experiences it through vegetation, drinking water, shade, breeding sites, and the survival of its prey. Gradual change can allow adaptation or migration. Rapid change compresses the options. Repeated change does something more subtle. It prevents ecosystems from settling into a durable pattern before the next pressure arrives. The Permian, especially in its later chapters, may have been a world where the rules kept shifting. In such a world, success can be real and temporary at the same time. The great synapsid predators and herbivores may dominate their landscapes, but dominance within a narrowing range is not safety. The shellbeds and reefs may appear rich, but richness in selected basins does not mean the global ocean is secure. A record of survival after one disturbance can be misread as proof of strength, when it may simply show that the threshold has not yet been crossed. The deeper warning is that Earth's systems were becoming easier to push into feedback. A feedback occurs when a change strengthens the conditions that caused or intensified it. Warming can reduce oxygen in seawater, which stresses marine life and changes chemical cycles. Plant loss can weaken carbon uptake and damage soils, which affects climate and erosion. Volcanic gases can warm the atmosphere, which alters rainfall, which changes vegetation, which changes the movement of carbon and nutrients into the sea. Such linkages do not require every proposed mechanism to be equally certain. They show why a mass extinction can grow from several interacting stresses rather than one isolated cause. By the time the end-Permian eruptions begin at their greatest scale, the planet already contains these pathways of amplification. The Capitanian crisis, earlier ecological turnover, Pangaea's severe geography, and the sensitivity of marine chemistry all form part of the same warning landscape. The final disaster will have a main engine, but it will not act alone. It will move through a world already organized in ways that allow disturbance to deepen. That is why the years before the Great Dying should not be treated as a quiet waiting room before the true event. They are part of the event's meaning. They show a biosphere that has survived earlier injury, but perhaps at a cost that is difficult to measure from fossils alone. They show that extinction can begin as reduced resilience, long before the most visible losses arrive. They show that the line between ordinary environmental change and planetary crisis is not always sharp. For many organisms, the world may have remained livable until it suddenly did not. For lineages already diminished, one more pressure could turn rarity into disappearance. For ecosystems already simplified, one more disruption could remove the last supports holding them together. The warning, then, is not a trumpet in the rocks. It is a thinning of possibilities. It is the loss of margin. It is the quiet fact that when Siberia begins to burn on a scale the surface world cannot absorb, Earth's living systems may already be closer to failure than their abundance suggests. The Siberian traps do not begin as a single mountain opening in the way an ordinary eruption might be imagined. They begin as a province of fire, a region where the deep interior of Earth finds repeated pathways into the crust and onto the surface, pouring out basaltic lava over what is now northern Asia. The word traps comes from a term for steppes, because the cooled lava can weather into broad stair-like layers, one flow resting upon another across a landscape remade by molten rock. In late Permian time, this is not only a local eruption, it is one of the largest known volcanic episodes in the history of the continents. A large igneous province so immense that its effects cannot be contained by the place where lava reaches daylight. Flow after flow spreads across the surface. Magma also pushes underground, intruding into older rocks, heating them, cracking them, and driving chemical reactions that release gases from the crust itself. The visible lava is only part of the event. Beneath it, unseen chambers and sheets of molten rock work through sediments rich in coal, carbonates, evaporites, and organic material, turning buried geology into another source of atmospheric change. The catastrophe therefore rises from two depths at once, from the mantle, which supplies the heat and magma, and from the crust, which is baked by that heat and gives up stored carbon, sulfur, methane, and other volatile compounds. This is why Siberia becomes more than a volcanic setting. It becomes an engine capable of disturbing the air, the ocean, the climate, and eventually the living world that depends on all three. A basalt flood eruption is different from the image of one cone throwing ash above a familiar skyline. It can open along long fissures, with lava spreading in sheets across enormous distances. Each flow may cool, darken, crack, and be buried by the next. Over time, the land becomes a stack of former surfaces, each one a record of fire made solid. The timescale matters to a human life. Even a small eruption can feel sudden and overwhelming. To geology, the Siberian traps unfold across intervals long enough for ecosystems to be stressed, recover partially, and be struck again, or long enough for slow chemical changes to accumulate into a global imbalance. The eruptions may include pulses rather than a perfectly even outpouring, and those pulses are important because biology responds to rate as much as magnitude. A planet can sometimes absorb a change if it arrives slowly enough for weathering, ocean circulation, and ecological adjustment to respond. When gases enter the atmosphere faster than stabilizing systems can remove or buffer them, the same total amount becomes far more dangerous. In the late Permian, the volume of volcanic rock and the speed of release together suggest a forcing large enough to push Earth out of its earlier range. The atmosphere receives carbon dioxide directly from volcanic degassing, and possibly additional carbon gases from heated sediments. Carbon dioxide traps outgoing heat and warms the surface. This is a simple statement, but in a living world, its consequences are not simple. Warmer air changes evaporation. Evaporation changes rainfall. Rainfall changes vegetation. Vegetation changes soil stability and carbon uptake. The ocean absorbs part of the added carbon, changing its chemistry. Warming water holds less dissolved oxygen, and sluggish circulation can allow deeper waters to become oxygen poor. Every one of these consequences touches life through a different door. A plant suffers through heat, drought, acid rain, altered growing seasons, damaged leaves, weakened roots, and soils that no longer behave as before. A marine animal encounters warmer water, lower oxygen, greater acidity, and greater difficulty building or maintaining a shell. The Siberian eruptions matter because they turn geology into environment. They translate molten rock into altered weather, altered water, and altered metabolism. Sulfur compounds add another layer of instability. Volcanic sulfur can form aerosols high in the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight and producing short-term cooling, even as carbon dioxide drives longer-term warming. This combination is not a contradiction. It is part of the violence of the system. The same volcanic episode can create brief intervals of dimming, acid rain, and cooling, while also loading the atmosphere with greenhouse gases that persist longer and build heat over time. For living organisms, such swings can be especially hard. A cold or dark interval may damage plants and reduce photosynthesis. A warming interval may then deepen drought and ocean stress. Repetition can prevent recovery if the eruptions arrive in pulses. Each pulse may strike before the effects of the last have fully faded. The world does not receive one clean injury. It receives a sequence of injuries with different chemical signatures and different durations. Ash and aerosols can affect light. Acid compounds can affect leaves, fresh water, soils, and shallow seas. Greenhouse gases can change the climate baseline. Heated organic deposits can add methane or other carbon-rich gases, intensifying warming still further. The result is a planetary disturbance with several hands, each pressing on a different part of the biosphere. The setting of the Siberian traps makes this especially consequential because the magma does not move only through bare volcanic rock. It intrudes into sedimentary basins containing materials that can release greenhouse and toxic gases when heated. Sills, which are sheet-like intrusions of magma, spread laterally underground. They bake surrounding rock and can create networks of vents that carry gases upward. In places where magma heats coal and organic-rich sediments, carbon stored for immense spans of time can return abruptly to the surface system. In places where it interacts with evaporite deposits, halogens and sulfur compounds may be released, with potential effects on atmospheric chemistry and acid rain. These details matter because they help explain why the Siberian traps are linked so strongly with the Great Dying. Lava alone is destructive locally, but lava covering a distant region does not directly kill marine animals around the world. Gases can, climate can, ocean chemistry can. The hidden interaction between magma and crust offers a path from eruption to global extinction. It shows how a volcanic province becomes a planetary event. The land near the eruptions would have been transformed most visibly. Lava fields replace living surfaces. Fires may sweep through vegetation. Rivers are dammed, redirected, or heated. Ash and toxic gases pass through nearby air. But the deeper danger travels beyond the horizon. Carbon dioxide does not remain over Siberia. Sulfur aerosols can be carried through the atmosphere. Weathering of fresh basalt can change chemical flows into rivers and oceans. The volcanic province becomes connected to places that never see a lava flow. This distance between cause and suffering is one of the strange features of the Great Dying. A reef far away can begin to fail because of gases released from a province it will never touch. A forest beyond the volcanic field can decline under changed rainfall or poisoned precipitation. Animals can starve because plants respond first. Predators can disappear because herbivores disappear before them. The chain is long, but it is not vague. It is built from physical transfers: gas into air, heat into climate, carbon into ocean, acid into rain, stress into bodies, absence into food webs. Even the name Siberian traps can make the event seem like an object, a region that can be pointed to on a map. In the late Permian, it is better understood as a process. It is an interval during which Earth's interior repeatedly enters the surface world and changes the rules under which life operates. The eruptions do not need to cover the whole planet with lava to affect the whole planet. They only need to alter the shared systems that connect every habitat. The atmosphere is one such system. The ocean is another. The carbon cycle is another. Once these begin shifting together, local resilience becomes less useful, because every refuge still breathes the same air, and many ultimately depend on the same climate and chemical boundaries. Some organisms may endure the first changes, especially those with broad tolerances or flexible habits. Others may find their narrow adaptations turning against them. Shell builders face different costs. Plants face different water and light. Burrowers may escape heat briefly but not the loss of food. Large animals may move farther than small ones, but they must also eat more. Volcanism does not choose among them, yet its effects sought them with brutal patience. The first great volcanic pulses, therefore, mark a transition in the story from background vulnerability to active forcing. Pangaea has shaped the world. Earlier crises have thinned its margins. And the Permian biosphere has remained impressive despite those pressures. Now the source of change deepens. The crisis is no longer only the consequence of geography or prior instability. It has an engine. That engine does not roar once and fall silent. It repeats, expands, intrude, degasses, and leaves behind stone as the record of its work. In those layered basalts, the later world reads a physical memory of release heat from below, carbon into air, chemicals into rain and sea, and a chain of disturbances long enough to remake evolution. The disaster is still unfolding at this stage. Many lineages have not yet vanished. Forests still stand in some places. Seas still hold their old survivors. Synapsids still move across the land, but the balance has begun to tilt in a way that ordinary adaptation cannot easily answer. Siberia is burning in the language of deep earth, and the surface world is beginning to inherit the flame. Carbon does not move through Earth as a single substance with one simple path. It travels through air, ocean, rock, soil, plants, shells, microbes, buried organic matter, and volcanic gases. Passing from in ordinary geological time, this movement can act like a slow thermostat. Volcanoes release carbon dioxide. Weathering draws some of it back toward rock and sea, and buried organic matter stores another portion away from the surface. None of this is perfectly balanced, and Earth has never held one fixed climate for long, but over immense spans. The carbon cycle can soften extremes by moving carbon between the atmosphere, ocean, and crust. The danger at the end of the Permian is that this cycle begins receiving carbon faster and in stranger forms than the stabilizing processes can easily handle. The Siberian eruptions do not merely add heat and lava to the surface. They inject carbon into a system already shaped by Pangea, exposed to dryness and carrying earlier disruption. Once that carbon begins to accumulate in the air and sea, the disaster moves from eruption into feedback. The atmosphere warms, the ocean changes, plants struggle, soils weaken, and the same living systems that once helped moderate carbon become less able to do so. What begins as a volcanic signal becomes a planetary imbalance. The first movement is greenhouse warming. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere allows sunlight to reach the surface while making it harder for heat to escape back into space. The consequences depend on scale and speed. A modest rise over a long span can shift climate zones gradually. A sharper rise can force landscapes, oceans, and organisms into conditions outside their established tolerances. In the late Permian, volcanic carbon dioxide would have built upon a world already prone to aridity across the interior of Pangea. Warmer air can hold more water vapor, which can intensify some rainfall patterns while also increasing evaporation from soils and plants. Regions already dry may become harsher. Seasonal droughts may lengthen. Heat stress may increase even in areas where water remains present. Plants stand at the center of this change because they are both living organisms and part of the carbon cycle itself. They take in carbon dioxide, use sunlight to build tissue, and return water vapor to the air through their leaves. When forests and plant communities weaken, carbon uptake changes, moisture movement changes, and soil stability changes. A stressed plant world is therefore not just a victim of climate disruption, it becomes a damaged part of the machinery that once helped regulate climate. The volcanic gases are not limited to carbon dioxide. Sulfur compounds can produce acid rain and short-term atmospheric dimming. Halogen gases may disturb atmospheric chemistry. Methane, whether released directly or produced through the heating of organic rich sediments, adds another possible layer because it is a potent greenhouse gas over shorter timescales. The exact mix and timing remain subjects of research, but the broad implication is clear enough. Life was not facing one clean chemical change. It was facing a shifting atmosphere. At times, aerosols may have reduced sunlight, harming photosynthesis and cooling the surface temporarily. Over longer intervals, greenhouse gases drove warming. Acidic precipitation could damage leaves, alter freshwater systems, and change soils. This combination is especially difficult because organisms adapt not to averages alone, but to the sequence of stresses they actually experience. a plant weakened by dim light, acid rain, or drought may be less able to survive heat. A landscape that loses vegetation becomes more vulnerable to erosion, and erosion then carries altered loads of sediment and nutrients into rivers and coastal seas. In this way, the atmosphere's chemical disturbance becomes written into soil and water. Weathering is one of the main long-term ways Earth removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the Siberian traps might seem, at first, to strengthen that removal. Fresh basalt weathers relatively quickly, and as rain and chemical reactions break it down, carbon can eventually be drawn into minerals and marine sediments. But this stabilizing response is not immediate enough to prevent crisis when the release is rapid and repeated. The thermostat works slowly. The volcanic forcing may arrive faster. Meanwhile, climate warming changes, weathering patterns unevenly, and damaged ecosystems alter how water moves through landscapes. Roots help break rock, hold soil, and regulate the passage of water. Microbes and fungi help process organic matter. Vegetation slows erosion and keeps sediment from rushing too abruptly into rivers. When plant cover declines, the style of weathering and erosion can change. More material may be stripped from land surfaces, not necessarily in a calm way that stores carbon efficiently, but in pulses that bury soils, choke waterways, and deliver nutrients to coastal oceans. Those nutrients can feed microbial blooms, and when such blooms die and decay, they consume oxygen. Thus, damage on land can worsen oxygen loss in water. The carbon cycle does not unravel in isolation. It is tied to nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, iron, and the breathing of organisms too small to see. Methane feedbacks may have added to this instability. Methane can come from wetlands, microbes, heated organic deposits, or destabilized marine reservoirs, depending on conditions. Some hypotheses have proposed that methane-producing microbes became more active under the altered chemistry of late Permian oceans, releasing large amounts of methane and intensifying warming. Other ideas focus on methane liberated when magma intruded into coal and organic-rich sediments, or when warming affected buried reservoirs. Not every proposal carries the same level of support, and the exact contribution remains debated. What matters in the broader structure is that methane represents the kind of feedback that can make a warming world warm faster. Carbon dioxide begins the pressure. Heat changes environments. Changed environments release or generate additional greenhouse gases. The added gases increase heat again. If such loops operate strongly enough, the climate does not need a new external trigger at every step. It begins amplifying its own disturbance. For organisms, this means that conditions can move away from habitability even after the initial volcanic pulse has passed. The world keeps responding. The ocean receives much of the burden. As carbon dioxide increases in the air, more dissolves into seawater. There it reacts chemically and lowers the availability of carbonate ions, which shell-building animals need for making calcium carbonate skeletons and shells. This is the process called ocean acidification. Though the sea does not need to become acidic in the everyday sense to become more difficult for many organisms, it only needs to shift enough that building and maintaining shells becomes harder. Brachiopods, corals, some planktonic organisms, reef builders, and other marine animals with hard parts are especially vulnerable. At the same time, warming reduces the amount of oxygen seawater can hold. Warmer oceans can also become more stratified, with layers that mix less easily. When oxygen from the surface fails to reach deeper waters, bottom environments can become hypoxic, meaning low in oxygen, or anoxic, meaning effectively without usable oxygen for most animals. In some conditions, waters may also become sulfidic, carrying hydrogen sulfide produced by microbes in oxygen-poor settings. Such water can be toxic to many forms of life. A marine animal facing acidification, heat, low oxygen, and possible toxins is enclosed by a water body whose basic life support systems are failing together. This is where the great dying becomes more than an extinction caused by volcanoes. The volcanoes are the engine, but the killing field expands through feedbacks. Heat weakens oxygen supply. Low oxygen changes microbial processes. Microbial processes can alter sulfur and carbon chemistry. Acidification weakens skeleton builders. Reef collapse removes habitat. Plant decline reduces carbon uptake and changes erosion. Erosion and nutrient runoff affect coastal productivity and oxygen demand. The atmosphere and ocean keep exchanging gases, while life itself loses some of the capacity to buffer the exchange. Each part of the system pushes on another. This does not mean every habitat fails at the same speed or in the same way. Some regions may experience drought first, others acid rain, others ocean stagnation, others food web collapse. The pattern is uneven, but the direction becomes increasingly shared. The late Permian planet is moving toward a state in which many of the normal requirements of complex life are harder to maintain. The tragedy of a disrupted carbon cycle is that carbon is not poisonous by its mere presence. It is one of life's essential elements. It forms the backbone of organic molecules. It is drawn from the air by plants and algae, returned by breathing and decay, buried in sediments, released by volcanoes, and carried through the bodies of every organism. The crisis comes from imbalance, from too much moving too quickly into the wrong reservoirs, from stabilizing pathways being overwhelmed or damaged. The same element that allows forests, shells, muscles, and microbes to exist becomes, in excess and under rapid change, a force that alters climate and chemistry beyond recognition. This gives the end-Permian extinction its particular depth. It is not a foreign disaster imposed on Earth from outside. It is Earth's own cycling of matter accelerated into danger. Its internal systems driven past the range in which complex ecosystems had learned to live. Once that transmission is underway, the next losses no longer belong only to chemistry. They become visible in forests that thin, roots that fail to hold ground, herbivores that find less to eat, and predators whose strength can no longer protect them from the disappearance of everything below. Forests do not die as quickly as animals can flee, but in the late Permian, their decline becomes one of the most important ways the catastrophe reaches the land. A plant cannot leave a poisoned valley, a drying floodplain, or a season that no longer arrives with the same rain. It stands inside the disturbance and records it through leaves, roots, spores, trunks, pollen, and eventually absence. Before the Great Dying, Permian vegetation is not one uniform forest spread across the supercontinent. It varies by region and climate, with conifers, seed ferns, glossopterids in southern lands, and other plant communities occupying the wetter margins, river systems, and more favorable interiors of Pangaea. These plants form the quiet infrastructure of terrestrial life. They feed herbivores directly, feed decomposers after death, shelter smaller animals, shade soil, slow the movement of water, and hold carbon in living tissue and buried organic matter. Their work is so constant that it can disappear from the drama of predators and prey. Yet the land world depends on it more completely than on any single animal group. When the atmosphere begins to change under volcanic forcing, the first great terrestrial failure is not always the fall of the largest creature. It is the weakening of the green base beneath every creature. Acid rain would have been one of the more direct volcanic threats. Sulfur and other reactive gases released during large eruptions can combine with water in the atmosphere and return to the surface in rain that damages leaves, alters soils, and affects freshwater systems. Plants can tolerate many ordinary stresses, and some are adapted to poor soils or dry climates. But repeated chemical injury changes the balance. Leaves are the surfaces through which plants breathe and make food. Damage them often enough, and photosynthesis falls, soil chemistry shifts, and roots encounter conditions that make nutrient uptake harder. Fungal partners and microbial communities may change. Seedlings fail more easily than established adults, and when young plants fail, A forest can appear present for a time while its future has already thinned. This is one of the hidden forms of ecological collapse. An old stand may linger, but if replacement slows or stops, the community has begun to vanish before the trunks are gone. Volcanic dimming could add another pressure. Aerosols and ash in the atmosphere may reduce sunlight for intervals. And plants live by converting sunlight into chemical energy. A brief darkening is not the end of a forest, but repeated dimming during a period of acid rain, heat, and drought can reduce growth and reproduction. Then, as greenhouse warming strengthens, the problem changes shape again. More heat increases water stress. The great interior of Pangaea, already dry in many regions, becomes harsher. Evaporation pulls moisture from soil. Rivers and seasonal wetlands become less reliable. Plants close pores in their leaves to conserve water, but by doing so they also limit the exchange of gases needed for photosynthesis. Growth slows. Stressed vegetation becomes more vulnerable to disease, insects, fire, and erosion. The land does not need to turn instantly into desert for food webs to suffer. It only needs to produce less edible plant matter, fewer seeds, fewer sheltered places, and fewer stable soils year after year. Herbivores feel that change in their bodies. A large plant eater can travel in search of food, but movement costs energy, and energy is precisely what becomes harder to obtain when vegetation declines. Dicenodont, paraosaurs, and other Permian herbivores depend on plant communities whose growth is tied to climate and soil stability. If the best feeding grounds shrink toward rivers and remaining humid pockets, animals crowd into narrower spaces. Competition rises. Drought concentrates life around water and then makes those places fragile. Malnutrition reduces reproduction before it produces mass death. Young animals are especially vulnerable because they must grow quickly enough to survive but cannot travel or store reserves as effectively as adults. A population can fall even while some individuals remain strong. Predators then inherit the decline. Gorgonopsians and other carnivores may be powerful, but power does not create prey. As herbivore numbers fall or become patchier, predators range farther, compete more intensely, and fail to raise young. The collapse of the land food web is therefore not a simple line from volcano to animal death. It passes through vegetation, then through herbivores, then through carnivores, while also touching insects, soils, freshwater life, burrowers, scavengers, and microbes throughout. The fossil record preserves some of this collapse in plant remains and in the changes around the Permian-Triassic boundary. In some regions, diverse plant assemblages give way to simpler records dominated by spores, algae, fungi, or opportunistic forms. The so-called fungal spike, known from some boundary sections, has been interpreted as a sign that decomposers flourished on dead vegetation. Though its exact meaning can vary from place to place and has been debated, even with that caution, the broader picture remains stark. Forests were damaged severely in many regions, and the recovery of complex terrestrial vegetation appears to have been slow. A landscape after forest decline is not merely open, it is unstable. Without roots binding soil, rain can strip sediment from slopes and floodplains. Without canopy cover, ground temperatures shift more sharply. Without plant litter cycling steadily through the soil, the hidden economy of nutrients changes. Rivers receive more sediment and organic debris. Mud fills channels. Floods carry eroded material toward basins and coasts. The death of forests therefore moves outward from the place where trees once stood. It changes rivers and nearshore seas. It feeds back into the larger extinction by increasing stress beyond the land. Fire may also have become part of the altered world, though not in a single simple pattern. Dry vegetation can burn more easily, yet a landscape with too little plant matter may carry fire poorly. During transition intervals, when forests are stressed but not completely absent, fires can become more common or more severe in some regions. Charcoal in rocks can record ancient burning, And fire can accelerate ecological change by removing vegetation, exposing soil, and favoring opportunistic plants. After repeated burns, a forest may fail to return if climate has shifted beyond the range needed for its seedlings. The result is not only destruction but replacement by simpler communities. Plants that grow quickly, disperse widely, or tolerate disturbance may dominate where older forest systems cannot reassemble. For herbivores specialized on certain food sources, such replacement may be almost as damaging as total loss. The land may remain green in patches, but it is no longer the same kind of green. Its nutrition, seasonality, shelter, and structure have changed. Insects are drawn into this transformation as well. The end-Permian marks one of the most severe known crises for insect life. Unusual because insects often pass through mass extinctions with less obvious loss than many marine animals. Plant-eating insects depend on leaves, wood, seeds, sap, and the timing of plant growth. If host plants decline or vanish, the insects tied to them lose their world. Flowering plants are far in the future, but Permian insects still have intricate relationships with vegetation as feeders, borers, detritivores, and prey. When forests thin, insect habitats shrink. When dead plant matter accumulates, decomposer communities may expand in some settings while other groups disappear. Aquatic insects and freshwater organisms are affected by acid rain, sediment, and changing stream flow. The terrestrial crisis is therefore not confined to large vertebrates. It reaches into the small moving life that makes ecosystems function at scales less visible to the fossil record. A forest is a vertical world. It contains canopy, trunks, bark, roots, litter, shade, humidity, burrows, nests, climbing surfaces, and hidden food. Remove it, and the land loses dimensions. Animals that once found protection in plant cover become exposed. Burrowers may retreat underground, but they still depend on surface productivity. Amphibians, already limited by water needs, face altered streams and drying habitats. Small reptiles and synapsids may survive better than giants because they require less food and can use shelter more flexibly. But even they cannot survive a landscape where basic productivity remains depressed for too long. The great dying on land is thus a reduction in complexity before it is a replacement of one ruler by another. It takes a world with many layers and flattens it. It removes canopy, narrows food, exposes soil, simplifies communities, and makes survival depend on tolerance rather than dominance. The great animals of the period are memorable because they have bones, teeth, tusks, and skulls that can be reconstructed. Plants leave a quieter record, but they decide the possible size and richness of the land. When they fail, the animal losses become almost inevitable. A Gorgonopsian can endure heat for a day, hunger for a time, and competition across a season, but it cannot endure the long disappearance of the herbivores beneath it. A Dicynodont can survive drought if enough forage returns, but not if each recovery is weaker than the last. A forest can recover from storm, fire, or flood if climate still permits regrowth, but not if the atmosphere itself has moved the boundaries of life. Under poisoned skies, the late Permian land begins to lose its memory of abundance. Some green remains, some animals persist, and some lineages will cross the boundary. But the old structure is breaking from the base upward. The next great failure will occur where the damage is even more complete. In the seas that cover most of the planet, where warmth and oxygen loss turn water into a narrowing space of breath. The most dangerous change in the Permian Ocean is not visible from the surface. A sea can still shine under daylight while its deeper water is losing breath, and it can still carry waves against the shore while its chemistry turns against the animals inside it. By the time the end-Permian crisis reaches the oceans, the atmosphere has already been altered by volcanic carbon. The climate is warming, and land ecosystems are shedding soil. nutrients, and organic matter into rivers and coasts. The marine world receives all of this quietly at first. Carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater. Heat enters the upper layers. Circulation patterns respond to changes in temperature, wind, rainfall, and salinity. Nutrients feed microbial growth in some regions. Dead organic material sinks and decays. Each step may seem ordinary, because oceans are always exchanging gases, heat, and matter with the rest of Earth. The crisis comes from scale and persistence. The water begins to lose the qualities that complex marine animals require: enough oxygen to breathe, enough chemical stability to build shells, and enough circulation to keep habitats from turning stagnant. The Great Dying becomes most severe in this hidden medium, not because the ocean is weak, but because every marine body is immersed in the conditions that are failing. Anoxia is the name for water without usable oxygen for most animals, and it is one of the central dangers of the end-Permian Sea. Oxygen enters the ocean from the atmosphere and from photosynthetic organisms near the surface, then spreads downward through mixing and circulation. In a cooler, well-mixed sea, deeper waters can remain supplied enough for bottom-dwelling life. In a warmer and more stratified sea, the layers mix less easily. Warm water tends to stay above denser, deeper water, and if the connection between surface and depth weakens, oxygen is not replaced as quickly below. At the same time, decay continues. Microbes consume oxygen as they break down sinking organic matter. If nutrients from eroded landscapes or disturbed circulation feed blooms near the surface, then the decay of that extra organic material can draw down oxygen even more. The bottom does not need to be sealed forever. It only needs to be cut off long enough, often enough, and widely enough for animals that cannot tolerate low oxygen to die, retreat, or fail to reproduce. For a brachiopod fixed to the seafloor, a crinoid rooted in place, or a burrowing animal enclosed by sediment, there may be no real escape from water that no longer supports respiration. Low oxygen is not the only problem. As carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, it changes the balance of dissolved carbon compounds and reduces the availability of carbonate ions, the material many organisms use to build calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. This does not mean shells instantly dissolve everywhere. The effect depends on depth, temperature, local chemistry, and the kind of mineral an organism uses. But even a moderate shift can make shell building more costly. A creature that once built a shell easily may need more energy to maintain the same structure. Larval stages may be especially vulnerable because they are small, delicate, and often less able to regulate internal chemistry. Reef builders face a similar burden. If the water becomes less favorable for carbonate growth, reefs struggle to keep adding structure. If warming and low oxygen arrive at the same time, the problem compounds. An animal weakened by heat may be less able to survive chemical stress. A shell builder spending more energy on its skeleton has less energy for growth and reproduction. A reef that grows more slowly loses the race against erosion, boring organisms, storms, and decay. The architecture of the marine world then begins to come apart. Once reef structures decline, the losses spread beyond the animals that built them. Reefs create surfaces and shelter. They slow currents, trap sediment, and provide small spaces where many organisms can feed, hide, or settle as young. When those structures weaken, the surrounding community loses its shape. Predators lose hunting grounds. Small animals lose refuge. Filter feeders lose the currents and positions that made feeding efficient. The collapse of a reef is therefore not a single extinction, but a habitat failure. In the Permian crisis, reefs suffer severely, and in many places the early Triassic seas that follow are comparatively simple. Microbial mats and low-diversity communities appear where richer Paleozoic systems once stood. Such simplicity is not emptiness, but it is a different kind of life, one that suggests the usual builders and grazers have been reduced and that microbial processes have gained space. The seafloor after oxygen loss may become a place where animals are fewer, Burrows are rarer, and the sediment itself records a quieter, less stirred world. In normal marine sediment, worms, arthropods, mollusks, and other organisms churn the upper layers as they move, feed, and hide. This mixing, called bioturbation, is a sign of animals working through the bottom. When oxygen declines, bioturbation can fade. Sediments may become finely layered because fewer animals disturb them. Chemical signals may show conditions in which oxygen is absent and sulfur cycling becomes stronger. In some settings, microbes produce hydrogen sulfide, a toxic compound associated with oxygen-poor environments. If such sulfidic water expands upward or onto shelves, it creates a direct chemical threat to animals already struggling with heat and low oxygen. The sea becomes hostile not only by withholding breath, but by adding poisons created through the altered metabolism of the microbial world. This is one of the stark reversals of the crisis. Microbes, among the oldest and most resilient forms of life, do not disappear when complex ecosystems falter. In some damaged settings, they expand into the space left by animals. The ocean becomes more ancient in character, not because time moves backward, but because the balance shifts towards simpler and hardier biological processes. The vulnerability of marine animals also reflects the limits of movement. Some swimmers can leave a worsening basin for a time, and some species may track suitable water along coasts or into deeper or shallower zones. But movement does not solve a global chemical change. If low oxygen spreads across continental shelves, if warming affects broad latitudes, and if acidification alters shell building across large regions, then escape routes narrow. Animals adapted to cold or oxygen-rich water may retreat until no suitable habitat remains. Bottom dwellers, tied to particular sediments, cannot relocate quickly across oceans. Reef communities cannot move as whole structures. Planktonic larvae may drift, but they still need a place to settle. The more widespread the stress, the more migration becomes delay rather than rescue. The end-Permian ocean seems to have forced many lineages into exactly that narrowing. Ancient groups that had survived earlier Paleozoic crises were caught by a combination of stresses that reached their basic physiology. Trilobites, already reduced in diversity, vanish completely. Many brachiopods disappear. Corals and other reef builders suffer losses so severe that reef ecosystems take a long time to regain former complexity. Crinoids, ammonoids, mollusks, and many other groups are cut back sharply, though some survivors seed later recoveries. The pattern is not random. Animals dependent on stable oxygen and carbonate chemistry are especially exposed. Those with broader tolerances, faster reproduction, smaller size, or flexible habits may stand a better chance. But even those advantages are limited when the sea itself is repeatedly altered. The ocean's suffering also feeds back into the atmosphere and climate. Oxygen-poor waters change the way carbon and nutrients are stored or released. The burial of organic matter, the activity of sulfur-cycling microbes, and the chemistry of sediments all influence the broader Earth system. A damaged ocean is not merely a container of dying animals. It is a chemical engine whose altered state can prolong or deepen instability. When deep waters become anoxic, the usual pathways of decay, burial, and nutrient recycling shift. When reefs stop building, carbonate production changes. When plankton communities reorganize, food webs and carbon export change. The great marine extinction therefore removes bodies while also changing processes. It weakens the ocean's role as a stabilizing reservoir and turns it into another part of the crisis. This is why the sea takes the brunt of the great dying. Marine life is surrounded by the evidence of planetary change before it can escape it. The water grows warmer, less oxygenated, more chemically difficult, and in places toxic. Food webs simplify. Habitat structures fail. Ancient lineages reach the end of histories that had crossed unimaginable spans. The final silence of the trilobites, the reduction of reef builders, the thinning of shell beds, and the decline of seafloor activity all speak to the same transformation. The ocean remains immense. But immensity does not guarantee refuge. Its vastness only means the disturbance has room to spread. In the rocks, the suffering is preserved without motion: dark shales, altered carbon signals, missing fossils, simplified communities, and boundaries where abundance drops away. What was once a living sea of shells, stalks, spirals, burrows, and reefs becomes, across many regions, a water world struggling to breathe. The next task is to measure that loss, not as a cold exercise in numbers, but as a way of understanding how close complex life came to having much of its long experiment erased. The scale of the great dying is difficult to describe because the ordinary language of loss becomes too small for it. A single extinction can be imagined as the disappearance of one animal, one plant, one recognizable form from the world. A mass extinction removes not only forms, but relationships, habitats, experiments, and possibilities. At the end of the Permian, the losses reach through the taxonomic structure by which life is later organized: species, genera, families, and entire larger groups. These categories are human tools, made long after the animals vanished, but they help reveal the depth of the cut. A species is the narrowest common unit, a lineage of organisms sharing close ancestry and reproductive continuity. A genus gathers closely related species. A family gathers broader related groups above them. When an extinction removes many species, the wound is severe. When it removes many genera and families, it means whole branches of form and function have been pruned away. The end-Permian crisis does this on a planetary scale. In the seas, the estimated loss rises to around 9/10 or more of marine species, with many reconstructions placing it near 96%. On land, the loss among vertebrates is also devastating, with roughly 7/10 of known species disappearing. The exact numbers vary because the fossil record is incomplete, uneven, and always being refined. But the direction is unmistakable. No other known mass extinction cuts so deeply across the complex life of Earth. To measure this disaster is not to reduce it to arithmetic. It is to use numbers as shadows cast by a living world that almost did not continue in its familiar form. Marine losses stand at the center of that measurement because the ocean preserves abundant fossils and because the oceanic collapse is so widespread. Brachiopods, once among the most successful animals in Paleozoic seas, are devastated. Some lineages survive, but the older dominance is broken. Corals and reef builders suffer so severely that reef ecosystems remain impoverished for a long time afterward. Crinoids decline, and their ancient seafloor meadows are cut back. Ammonoids are driven through a narrow bottleneck, with only a few survivors giving rise to later diversity. Trilobites, after nearly the whole span of the Paleozoic, vanish completely. Their disappearance is one of the clearest symbolic endings in the fossil record, but it is only one part of a much wider silence. Many mollusks, sponges, bryozoans, echinoderms, and other invertebrates are reduced or reorganized. Some groups that had shaped seafloor ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years lose their old place permanently. The extinction does not merely remove rare forms at the edges. It strikes common and foundational animals, the kinds that made entire marine communities recognizable. That is why the boundary feels so sharp in many rocks. It is not only that some fossils stop appearing, it is that the structure of abundance changes. Beds, once rich in diverse shells, give way to simpler assemblages. Microbial fabrics, disaster taxa, and low-diversity communities that suggest a sea recovering from exhaustion rather than continuing its earlier rhythm. On land, the record is more difficult to read, but the pattern remains severe. Bones are preserved only in particular basins, and terrestrial ecosystems leave a patchier archive than marine shelves. Even so, the disappearance of major Permian vertebrates is unmistakable. The great Gorgonopsians, apex predators of late Permian landscapes, Do not cross into the Triassic. Paleosaurs, heavy-bodied herbivorous reptiles of the Old World, vanish. Many large amphibians decline sharply or disappear from many regions. Numerous therapsid groups are reduced, and the ecological power of synapsids is broken. Dicynodonts survive through a narrow passage, but many forms are lost before a few survivors dominate later. Cynodonts survive as well, but not as rulers of the open world. The land after the boundary is not a continuation of the same communities with fewer species. It is a different ecological arrangement. The old predator structures are gone. Large herbivore diversity is reduced. Food webs simplify. The animals that remain occupy a world with fewer competitors, fewer familiar plants, and fewer stable habitats. The numbers convey severity, but the ecological meaning lies in the empty roles, hunters without successors for a time, plant eaters gone from landscapes they once shaped, amphibian communities contracted, insect lineages removed, and soils and vegetation altered beneath them all. Insects deserve special attention because their crisis is unusual. Across many mass extinctions, insects often appear resilient, partly because of small size, rapid reproduction, flexible life cycles, and immense ecological variety. At the end of the Permian, however, insect losses include the disappearance of entire orders. Plant-feeding insects are especially vulnerable when plant communities collapse or reorganize. A leaf eater tied to a host plant cannot survive if that plant disappears across its range. Wood borers, sap feeders, detritivores, and aquatic larvae are all affected by changes in forests, soils, rivers, and wetlands. The extinction of some 6-winged Paleozoic insects, including Paleodictyopterans and related groups, marks a deep break in the history of terrestrial arthropods. The air and vegetation of the Permian had carried insects unlike anything living now. Many of those experiments end here. Their loss is less visible than the fall of a saber-toothed predator or the disappearance of trilobites. But it matters because insects help make land ecosystems work. They process plant matter, feed other animals, disturb soil, and participate in relationships that the fossil record only partly preserves. When insect orders vanish, it means the crisis has entered the small machinery of the land, not merely its large animals. Measuring the dying also requires caution about time. The extinction is often spoken of as a boundary, but the biological collapse may have unfolded in pulses, with different durations in marine and terrestrial settings. Some evidence suggests the most intense marine losses may have occurred over a geologically brief interval, while land ecosystems may have declined and recovered across a more drawn-out span. But geologically brief does not mean instantaneous in the human sense. Even a span of many thousands of years can be short in rock time and long in lived generations. For animals and plants, the catastrophe would not be experienced as one date. It would be experienced as worsening seasons, failing reproduction, migration into poorer habitat, repeated environmental shocks, and the disappearance of once common neighbors. A lineage does not go extinct when its last fossil is buried. It goes extinct when its last living population fails to leave descendants. That final failure may come after long decline, after bottlenecks, after scattered refuges, after the loss of genetic variety and ecological support. The fossil boundary is the visible edge of a process that must have been intimate for every population caught inside it. The severity of the event is also measured by recovery. After some extinctions, ecosystems rebound relatively quickly on geological terms, with surviving groups diversifying into open roles. After the Great Dying, recovery is slow and uneven. Marine ecosystems remain simplified in many regions into the early Triassic. Reef building is delayed. Seafloor communities show reduced burrowing and lower diversity. On land, landscapes remain unstable. Plant communities struggle, and vertebrate faunas are dominated by a small number of hardy survivors in some places. A fast recovery would suggest that the extinction removed many species, while leaving environmental foundations largely intact. The slow recovery after the end-Permian suggests something deeper. It means the conditions needed for complex ecosystems were themselves damaged. Heat, low oxygen, acidified seas, disrupted soils, and altered vegetation may have persisted or returned in pulses. Life survived, but it did not immediately regain its former complexity because the world it needed for recovery was still unstable. The aftermath becomes part of the measurement. A disaster that takes tens of millions of years for some systems to fully overcome is not simply large at the moment of loss. It changes the evolutionary direction of everything that follows. What remains most striking is not that life disappears completely, because it does not. Microbes endure. Plants persist in refuges and eventually recover. Some marine animals pass through. Some synapsids survive. Reptile lineages survive. Fishes continue. The flame is not extinguished, but it narrows to an extent unmatched in the history of complex life. The Great Dying nearly resets the visible biosphere without returning Earth to lifelessness. It removes enough that the next world cannot be a restoration of the old one. The Paleozoic's long experiment in marine abundance and synapsid land dominance is broken. The Triassic begins not as a triumphant renewal, but as an impoverished beginning, built from remnants. To measure the extinction, then, is to see both loss and selection. It is to understand that survival is not evenly distributed, and that the forms carrying life forward are often not the most impressive ones before the crisis. The largest predator may vanish while a smaller burrower remains. A dominant reef builder may disappear while a more tolerant organism endures. A lineage that seemed secondary may inherit the future because it happens to pass through a narrow environmental gate. The numbers point to the gate's severity, but the survivors reveal its shape. Earth does not choose them with purpose. Conditions change, and bodies either remain possible or they do not. At the end of the Permian, the most complex forms become impossible across much of the planet. What is left is enough to continue, but not enough to preserve the old world. The next boundary in the rocks is therefore more than a date between periods. It is the mark of a biological narrowing so profound that an entire era ends on one side, and a wounded, unfamiliar Earth begins on the other. A boundary in deep time is rarely a clean line in the world that lived through it. No animal crossed a visible border between the Permian and the Triassic. No forest knew that one era was ending beneath its roots. The line exists because later rocks preserve a change so large that the history of life has to be divided around it. Below the boundary, the old Paleozoic patterns still appear diverse marine invertebrates. Trilobites in their final chapter, brachiopod, rich seafloors, reef communities, synapsid-dominated land faunas, and plant assemblages shaped by Permian climates. Above it, the world is different. The fossils are fewer in many places. The communities are simpler. Certain shells no longer return. Entire animal groups are absent. Sediments carry signs of oxygen, poor water, disturbed carbon cycling, erosion, microbial expansion, and environmental instability. The Permian-Triassic boundary is therefore not simply a date assigned by geologists. It is a visible wound in the archive of Earth. A place where the long Paleozoic experiment stops being continuous and the early Mesozoic begins under the pressure of survival. In the field, such a boundary may appear quiet, sometimes no more dramatic than a change in color, texture, fossil content, or chemical signal across layers of limestone, shahale, mudstone, or sandstone. Yet the quietness is misleading. Rocks do not preserve catastrophe the way a witness remembers motion. They preserve it as rearrangement. A bed rich in shells gives way to one with few or none. A limestone formed in a living carbonate system is followed by darker sediment laid down under low oxygen. A trackway, burrow, or root trace disappears. Carbon isotopes shift, showing that the movement of carbon between atmosphere, ocean, life, and rock has been disturbed. The drama is not in noise, but in discontinuity. Geologists read these discontinuities with care, because the boundary is not identical everywhere. In some marine sections, it is sharp and fossil-rich enough to mark precisely. In some terrestrial basins, erosion, gaps in deposition, or patchy preservation make the transition harder to see. The work is therefore comparative. One place shows a fossil disappearance, another shows a chemical change, another preserves ash beds that can be dated from volcanic minerals, another reveals sedimentary signs of stressed environments. Together, they form a pattern stronger than any single outcrop could hold alone. The official boundary between the Permian and Triassic is defined in marine rocks by the first appearance of a particular conodont species, a tiny tooth-like element from an extinct eel-shaped animal. This may seem almost too small a marker for such an enormous turning point, but that smallness is part of geology's discipline. Boundaries are fixed by specific, traceable signals, not by the full emotional weight of what they represent. A conodont element is useful because it can be widespread, identifiable, and tied to a sequence of other changes. Around it gather the larger signs, the collapse of many marine groups, the carbon isotope excursion, the loss of reef systems, and the sedimentary evidence for an altered ocean. The boundary is thus anchored by a small fossil, while surrounded by the remains of a global crisis. There is a kind of humility in that. The end of an era is not marked by the largest skull or the most dramatic lava flow, but by a minute biological signal placed within a broader web of evidence. The planet changes at every scale at once, and the rock record catches those scales unevenly. One of the most important signals is the disturbance in carbon isotopes. Carbon atoms come in different forms, and living systems tend to use the lighter form more readily. When the balance between forms shifts in ancient rocks, it can reveal changes in burial, volcanic release, methane input, ocean circulation, or biological productivity. Across the end-Permian boundary, many sections show a sharp negative shift, meaning the surface carbon reservoir receives or records an increase in lighter carbon. This fits with a world disturbed by massive volcanic emissions, heated organic sediments, possible methane release, and the breakdown of ordinary carbon cycling. The isotope curve is not a fossil animal, but it is a trace of planetary metabolism. It shows that the extinction is tied to the Earth system itself, not merely to one local habitat failing. The same signal can be followed across distant regions, linking rocks that once formed in different seas. It is one of the ways the crisis becomes global in evidence rather than only global in interpretation. Sediments also preserve the condition of the ocean. Dark shales, finely laminated beds, and certain chemical markers can suggest low oxygen or anoxic conditions. When bottom waters contain enough oxygen, animals often churn the sediment as they burrow, feed, and move. Their activity mixes layers and leaves traces. When oxygen falls, burrowing declines, and sediments can settle in thin, undisturbed laminae. Such layering is not always simple to interpret, but in the context of other evidence, it becomes part of the wider picture. Seafloors, where ordinary animal life has retreated or vanished. In some places, biomarkers and mineral signals point toward euthynia, water that is both oxygen-poor and rich in hydrogen sulfide. Such conditions are hostile to many animals and may have expanded during the crisis. The boundary therefore records not only who died, but the physical state of the water in which they died. It turns the ocean from scenery into evidence. The sea itself becomes a text, written in chemistry and mud. On land, the boundary is often read through different signs. Fossil bones show the disappearance or reduction of major Permian vertebrates, but bones are rare compared with the abundance of marine shells. Plant fossils, pollen, spores, soils, and sedimentary features help complete the image. In some regions, gymnosperm forests decline and spore-producing plants or fungal remains become more common. This pattern has been interpreted as ecological disturbance, perhaps reflecting forest dieback, widespread decay, and the rise of opportunistic organisms in damaged landscapes. The meaning of any single fungal signal may be debated, because microscopic remains can have complex origins, but the broader evidence for terrestrial disruption is strong. Ancient soils may show signs of erosion, poor development, or altered climate. River deposits can indicate destabilized landscapes where vegetation no longer holds sediment as effectively. Tracks and burrows may become sparse. The land's boundary is therefore less like a single knife cut and more like a damaged surface, scraped, eroded, and unevenly preserved. Yet its message is consistent with the sea. The old systems are gone or greatly reduced. The fossil record above the boundary has a haunted simplicity. Some early Triassic marine communities are dominated by small, widespread, opportunistic organisms able to tolerate harsh or fluctuating conditions. Disaster taxa, as they are sometimes called, do not mean the world is lifeless. They mean that the living world has become simplified enough for a few hardy forms to become unusually common. The same pattern appears on land, with the extraordinary success of certain survivors in some regions. After a mass extinction, abundance can be misleading. A landscape filled with one or two common animals is not the same as a diverse ecosystem. It may be a sign that many competitors, predators, prey, and plants are missing. The boundary teaches this distinction with unusual force. Life continues immediately above it. But continuation is not recovery. The first Triassic world is alive, and it is deeply wounded. The start of the Mesozoic is not the confident opening of the age of reptiles. It is an interval of ecological poverty, climatic stress, and slow rebuilding. This is why the boundary between eras carries both geological and biological meaning. The Paleozoic begins in the great expansion of visible animal life and ends with its most severe known collapse. The Mesozoic will later become associated with dinosaurs, marine reptiles, pterosaurs, ammonites, cycads, conifers, and the slow rise of mammals in the shadows. But at its beginning, none of that later richness is secure. The Triassic inherits an exhausted planet. Its future diversity depends on survivors whose significance may not be obvious at first. A few ammonoids passing through marine bottlenecks, a few therapsids persisting on land, diapsid reptiles ready to diversify into open roles, plants regrowing across unstable landscapes, microbes reshaping damaged seas. The boundary does not create these futures by intention, but it clears away so much of the old world that the direction of evolution changes. Extinction becomes an evolutionary filter, not because it improves life, but because it removes possibilities and leaves others standing. The end-Permian line in stone is therefore a record of loss and selection at once. It closes the Paleozoic not with a single emblem, but with many absences layered together. No more trilobites, no old reef richness in its familiar form, no Gorgonopsian rulers on the land, no easy continuity of plant communities across many regions, no immediate restoration of the seafloor's former activity. Above the line, life is reduced, practical, and altered. Below it, the vanished world remains only as fossils, minerals, and chemical ratios. The boundary does not explain the catastrophe by itself, but it proves that the catastrophe reached the structure of life deeply enough to divide the planet's biological memory. In that division, deep time becomes visible. A person can place a hand on rock that formed before the crisis and then on rock that formed after it, and the space between them may be only a narrow interval of stone. Yet across that interval lies the greatest narrowing of complex life known from Earth's past. The next world begins there, not in triumph, but among remnants, where survival has become the first condition of evolution. Above the boundary, Earth does not recover by simply filling the empty spaces left behind. The first Triassic world is alive, but it is alive in a reduced register, with fewer kinds of animals, fewer stable habitats, fewer complex communities, and a climate system still unsettled by the forces that caused the dying. The rocks after the extinction often give the impression of a planet that has not yet regained its full ecological voice. Shell beds become simpler, burrows in marine sediment are fewer or shallower in many places. Reef frameworks are greatly diminished. On land, forests do not immediately return to the richness they once held, and river systems may carry the signature of soils loosened by vegetation loss. The boundary has passed, but the crisis has not fully ended. Survival is not the same as renewal. Many organisms make it through the worst interval only to face a world where the conditions needed for stable recovery remain damaged. Heat persists. Oceans continue to struggle with oxygen. Carbon cycling remains disturbed. Landscapes that once held layered plant communities may now support opportunistic growth, patchy vegetation, microbial crusts, or communities dominated by a narrow set of hardy forms. The aftermath of the Great Dying is therefore not a quick green return after fire. It is a long interval of biological poverty, where life continues. But the old complexity is gone, and the new one has not yet assembled. One of the most evocative signs of this damaged world is the expansion of decomposers and opportunists in some records. In certain sections near the Permian-Triassic transition, microscopic remains have been interpreted as a fungal spike, a possible signal of fungi feeding on enormous amounts of dead plant matter after forest collapse. The details are complex, and not every dark abundance of spores or filaments carries the same meaning. But the image remains powerful because it captures a real ecological possibility. Where forests die, decay has work to do. Trunks fall, roots rot, leaves and branches gather in soils no longer held in the same balance between growth and breakdown. Fungi, bacteria, algae, and other small organisms enter the spaces opened by death. They are not invaders from outside the living world. They are part of life's ordinary recycling. But after catastrophe, their role can become unusually visible. A landscape once structured by standing vegetation may become, for a time, a landscape of decomposition. The living system does not stop. It changes scale and emphasis. Instead of tall plants building habitats upward, the hidden organisms of decay may dominate the processing of what has fallen. The land after the extinction is also physically unstable. Roots bind soil, slow runoff, and help water enter the ground, rather than stripping surfaces away. When plant cover is reduced, rainfall can move sediment more violently. Rivers carry heavier loads. Channels shift. Floodplains are rebuilt under different conditions. Ancient soils may become thinner, less developed, or more easily eroded. This matters because recovery requires places where seedlings can establish, where small animals can find cover, where moisture can remain long enough for communities to rebuild. If the ground itself keeps moving, life has to keep beginning again. A barren slope can be colonized, but if each storm removes the new surface, the process is delayed. A river margin can grow plants, but if floods repeatedly bury or scour them under an altered climate, the habitat remains uncertain. The first Triassic landscapes may have held many such interruptions. They were not lifeless, but they were unreliable. The stability that allows diversity to accumulate had been weakened, and without stability, ecological richness returns slowly. In the sea, the ruins take another form. The absence of large reef systems is not simply an absence of structure. It is the loss of marine architecture. Reefs create vertical relief, shelter, feeding surfaces, nursery space, and chemically active zones where many kinds of organisms can live together. After the Great Dying, reef ecosystems remain suppressed for an extended interval, and many shallow seas are occupied by simpler assemblages. Some environments show microbial mats spreading over sediment surfaces where grazing animals and burrowers are scarce. These mats can stabilize the seafloor and record a world in which microbial life is taking advantage of the reduced activity of animals. This does not mean life is weak. Microbial life is ancient and durable. But when microbial textures become unusually prominent after a crisis in animal life, they suggest that the balance has shifted. The sea is still living, yet less animal-dominated. Fewer burrows mean less oxygen mixed into sediment. Fewer shell builders mean fewer hard surfaces and fewer carbonate structures. Fewer predators and grazers mean food webs become shorter and less varied. A shallow marine world can remain productive while becoming simplified. And that simplification is one of the clearest signs that recovery has not yet fully begun. Empty niches are often described as opportunities. And over long time they are. A niche is not a place on a map but a way of living, shaped by food, habitat, behavior, body size, metabolism, and relationships with other organisms. When a mass extinction removes large predators, reef builders, grazers, burrowers, plant eaters, or canopy plants, those roles become available in principle. But open opportunity does not guarantee immediate occupation. A lineage must possess the right traits, survive in the right place, reproduce under the new conditions, and diversify across enough time. After the Great Dying, many niches remain empty or only crudely filled because the surrounding environment is still harsh. It is difficult to become a large herbivore if plant productivity remains unstable. It is difficult to rebuild a reef if ocean chemistry and temperature continue to work against skeleton formation. It is difficult to restore a complex predator guild if prey diversity remains low. The early aftermath is therefore not an evolutionary festival. It is a bottleneck extended into landscape and sea. Life has room, but it does not yet have ease. This helps explain why some survivors become extraordinarily abundant. In a damaged ecosystem, a hardy generalist can spread widely because competitors are gone, and conditions favor tolerance over specialization. Such abundance can look like success, and in one sense it is. It means a lineage has found a way through conditions that destroyed many others. But abundance after mass extinction can also be a sign of poverty around it. When one animal, one shellfish, one microbe, or one plant type dominates, it may reveal that the ecosystem has lost the variety that once divided resources among many forms. Diversity is the difference between a living landscape with many strategies and one where only a few strategies remain practical. In the early Triassic, the survivors that become common do so in a world where many of the former strategies have failed. Their dominance is not the restoration of balance. It is the first rough shape of life after balance has been broken. The atmosphere and climate continue to slow recovery because extinction does not remove the causes of environmental stress. The Siberian volcanic episode and its consequences may have continued in pulses, and Earth system feedbacks do not stop at a boundary chosen by geologists. Greenhouse warmth can persist after eruptions decline. Oceans can remain oxygen poor after the first biological collapse. Weathering and carbon burial need time to draw down excess carbon. Damaged ecosystems need time to regain their own regulatory functions. The living world had once helped move water, store carbon, build soils, and stabilize coasts. After the extinction, those services are reduced. The planet must recover its biology, while the biology itself is one of the tools of recovery. This circular difficulty gives the early Triassic its long, strained character. Life is trying to rebuild the conditions that allow life to become complex again. Some forms are capable of moving through the ruins almost immediately. Small animals can hide, burrow, eat varied foods, reproduce faster, and endure patchy resources more easily than giants. Microbes can exploit chemical gradients and disturbed surfaces. Opportunistic plants can colonize open ground. Certain marine animals can tolerate low oxygen or unstable conditions better than others. These survivors carry continuity. Yet the grandeur of the late Permian is absent. There is no simple replacement for the lost reef builders, no immediate return of deep seafloor communities, no new apex predators instantly filling the place of gorgonopsians, no full restoration of forested landscapes across the wounded supercontinent. The world is quieter in the fossil record because fewer bodies are doing fewer kinds of work. The aftermath is shaped by endurance before creativity. Evolution has not stopped, but it is beginning again from a narrowed field. The strange quiet after the great dying is therefore not silence. It is reduced complexity. It is life speaking through fewer voices. Across damaged seas and unstable ground, the old Paleozoic world has ended so completely that even survival feels unfamiliar. The organisms that remain do not know they are remnants. They feed, grow, reproduce, and die under the conditions available to them. But from the distance of deep time, their world looks sparse, practical, and patient. It will take millions of years for ecosystems to regain richness, and even then, they will not become what they were before. Recovery is not reversal. It is construction with different materials. Among those materials, one survivor will become so common in some early Triassic landscapes that it seems almost to stand for the entire wounded age. A tusked synapsid, moving through the emptied spaces where a more varied world once lived. Lystrosaurus enters the early Triassic, not as a majestic replacement for the lost rulers, but as a survivor shaped for a world where grandeur has become less useful than endurance. Its body is compact, barrel-chested, low to the ground, and carried on sturdy limbs. Its skull is short and strong, with a beak for cropping vegetation and, in many species, a pair of tusks that give the face a blunt, persistent character. It belongs to the dicynodonts, the herbivorous synapsids that had already been important before the catastrophe. But after the boundary, its significance changes. It is no longer simply one animal among many in a varied Permian landscape. In several early Triassic fossil assemblages, especially in southern Pangaea, it becomes overwhelmingly common. Bones of Lystrosaurus appear again and again where the remains of more diverse communities might once have been expected. This abundance has made it one of the emblematic animals of the recovery interval, not because it restores the old world, but because it reveals how narrow the living world had become. A landscape full of Lystrosaurus is not a landscape fully healed. It is a landscape in which one hardy form has found space across the ruins left by many others. The animal's success begins with traits that look modest rather than spectacular. Lystrosaurus is often interpreted as a tough generalist, capable of feeding on low, coarse, or patchy vegetation and surviving in disturbed environments where more specialized herbivores may have struggled. Its beak could crop plant material efficiently, while its body plan suggests a creature built for steady movement, close to the ground, rather than speed or display. Some evidence has also been used to suggest burrowing behavior in at least parts of its lineage or close relatives. And even if every individual did not live underground, the possibility matters. Burrows offer shelter from heat, cold, predators, fire, and dry surface conditions. In an unstable early Triassic world, any ability to use the ground as protection could become deeply valuable. A burrow is not a luxury. It is a small climate, a shaded chamber where the extremes of a damaged surface are softened. For a survivor living through heat, drought, sparse vegetation, and ecological uncertainty, such protection could make the difference between a failed season and another generation. Its abundance also suggests flexibility in reproduction and growth. Though the details remain difficult to reconstruct, a species that becomes common after extinction must do more than survive as scattered adults. It must reproduce under new conditions, raise young successfully, and spread into habitats where competitors have vanished. Lystrosaurus seems to have done this repeatedly. In the Karoo Basin of southern Africa, its fossils are so prominent in early Triassic rocks that its name has been used to mark an entire assemblage zone. Its remains are also known from other parts of former Pangaea, including India and Antarctica, giving it a wide geographic reach that later helped support the idea that these lands had once been connected. The same animal appearing across now separated continents becomes a quiet witness to ancient geography. Its bones speak not only of survival after extinction, but of a supercontinent whose southern regions allowed movement across lands that are now divided by oceans. In this way, Lystrosaurus carries two histories at once, the biological history of a survivor and the geological history of Pangaea itself. Yet its dominance should not be mistaken for comfort. The early Triassic world in which Lystrosaurus flourishes is often called a recovery. But recovery here means something sparse and strained. Plant communities remain damaged in many places. Forests are reduced or patchy. Soils are unstable. Rivers may carry heavy sediment from landscapes no longer held tightly by vegetation. Climate remains hot and irregular. Under such conditions, a herbivore does not need lush abundance to succeed. It needs enough food, enough tolerance, and enough shelter to keep populations going when other animals fail. Lystrosaurus may have been well suited to this reduced world because it did not require the full complexity of the late Permian landscape. It could live in the simplified aftermath, feeding from what remained and multiplying where richer herbivore communities had collapsed. Its success is therefore almost austere. It is the success of a body that asks less from the world at a time when the world can give less. In fossil assemblages dominated by Lystrosaurus, the absence around it is as important as the animal itself. The great Gorgonopsian predators are gone. Many other dicynodonts are gone or greatly reduced. Parasaurs no longer shape the herbivore fauna. Diverse communities of large land vertebrates have been replaced. In some places, by a few survivors repeated across the record. This creates a strange kind of abundance. There may be many bones, but not many kinds. The eye of deep time sees life continuing. Yet the pattern is flattened. Diversity has collapsed into repetition. Such repetition can appear successful in a narrow sense, but it also reveals ecological poverty. A living world with many species can absorb pressure through alternatives. If one plant declines, another may feed some herbivores. If one prey species becomes rare, a predator may shift to another. If one habitat fails, some animals may move into a neighboring community. In a Lystrosaurus-dominated landscape, those alternatives are fewer. The survivor stands out because the supporting cast has thinned. Its abundance is a sign of resilience and a measure of loss at the same time. The animal itself would not have understood any of this. It moved through the early Triassic as a living body, not as a symbol. It searched for food, rested, reproduced, avoided danger, and followed the small pressures of hunger, temperature, thirst, and instinct. Its world may have contained open plains, river margins, recovering vegetation, dusty basins, and seasonal harshness. It may have encountered other survivors, including small cynodonts, procolophonids, amphibians, early archosaur relatives, and insects moving through altered plant communities. The landscape was not empty, but its complexity had been reduced. Predators existed, though the old apex forms were gone. Competition existed, though many former competitors had vanished. Lystrosaurus lived not in silence, but in a quieter ecological register, where survival depended on tolerating instability more than exploiting richness. In that world, ordinary actions became evolutionary consequences. Each feeding path, nesting site, burrow, herd movement, and surviving juvenile helped carry a branch of synapsid life through the narrowest passage in Earth's history. There is a temptation to treat Lystrosaurus as a winner of the great dying, but the word winner can mislead. Mass extinction is not a contest with a fair field. It is a filtering of life under conditions that are often chaotic, destructive, and indifferent. Lystrosaurus succeeds because its traits happen to match the damaged world better than the traits of many others. That success does not imply superiority in any lasting sense. As ecosystems recover and change, dominance will shift again. Other dicynodonts will diversify later in the Triassic, some becoming very large. But the early overwhelming presence of Lystrosaurus will not remain the permanent shape of life. It belongs to a particular interval, a biological aftershock, when the planet has room for survivors, but not yet for full complexity. Its reign is therefore both impressive and temporary. It marks the beginning of rebuilding, not its completion. The deeper meaning of Lystrosaurus lies in the kind of future it preserves. It is a synapsid, a member of the broad lineage that had dominated much of Permian land life, and that will, eventually, through other branches, lead toward mammals. But Lystrosaurus itself is not the direct ancestor of mammals. It is part of a side branch that thrives after the catastrophe and later declines. Its story shows that survival can happen in several forms. Some survivors preserve the future directly by giving rise to later lineages. Others reveal the conditions of recovery by becoming abundant in the spaces opened by extinction. Lystrosaurus does the second with unusual clarity. It shows what the early Triassic rewarded: toughness, broad tolerance, perhaps burrowing, efficient feeding, and the ability to reproduce in a diminished world. Its fossils make recovery tangible because they are not rare whispers. They are repeated statements in bone, saying that after the greatest loss, life did continue, but in a simplified shape. Eventually, the Lystrosaurus world gives way to something more varied. New predators appear, other herbivores expand, diapsid reptiles begin to occupy larger roles. Cynodonts persist in smaller, quieter ways, carrying a different part of the synapsid inheritance. Plants recover unevenly, and ecosystems slowly regain layers. But before those later changes, there is this stark interval in which one tusked herbivore becomes almost a signature of survival. Its commonness does not erase the catastrophe behind it. It makes that catastrophe clearer. Only a world deeply emptied could make such dominance possible across such breadth. In the shadow of the Great Dying, Lystrosaurus stands as evidence that life can pass through ruin without returning immediately to abundance. It is not the old world restored, and not yet the new world fulfilled. It is the breathing middle, a durable body on damaged ground, holding open time until evolution can begin to widen again. The mammal line survives the Great Dying without looking like a line destined for importance. After the extinction, the most visible synapsid survivor in many landscapes is Lystrosaurus. Common, sturdy, and unmistakable in the fossil record, the quieter inheritance belongs elsewhere. To cynodont, small therapsids whose bodies carry anatomical changes that will matter far beyond the damaged Triassic world in which they live. They do not stride into the aftermath as rulers. They do not immediately replace the lost Gorgonopsians or command the open plains as the largest herbivores. Many are modest animals, some no larger than living dogs or smaller, moving close to the ground, feeding on insects, small vertebrates, roots, seeds, or whatever a flexible diet allows. Their importance lies not in dominance, but in continuity. In their skulls, yaws, teeth, limbs, and perhaps in their coverings and habits. The old synapsid experiment narrows into a more durable form. The great Permian rulers have vanished, but a branch of their wider ancestry remains, reduced enough to survive, adaptable enough to persist, and anatomically prepared, though without intention, to become the distant source of mammals. This is one of the subtle reversals after the Great Dying. The future is not carried by the forms that had seemed most powerful before the crisis. It is carried by animals that may have spent much of the early Triassic avoiding notice. Cynodonts had already appeared before the extinction, and some crossed the boundary through the catastrophe. Their name means dog teeth, a reference to the more differentiated dentition that sets them apart from many earlier synapsids. In a simple reptile-like mouth, teeth often repeat similar shapes along the jaw. In cynodont, different teeth begin to do different work. Incisors, canines, and postcanine teeth suggest a more divided approach to feeding, with biting, holding, cutting, and processing separated into a more precise system. Chewing is not merely a detail of diet. It changes how efficiently food can be broken down before digestion. The jaw muscles also become more important, reshaping the skull around stronger bites and more controlled motion. These changes do not make cynodonts mammals yet, but they point toward a mammalian way of being, not a single invention appearing suddenly, but a long reorganization of the head and body under evolutionary pressure. The jaw itself holds one of the deepest transformations. In earlier synapsids, the lower jaw is made of several bones. In mammals, the lower jaw is dominated by a single bone. While some of the older jaw bones become part of the middle ear, cynodonts preserve stages along this transition, showing how bones involved in feeding can gradually shift toward hearing across deep time. Structures that once helped brace or move a jaw eventually contribute to the delicate transmission of sound. Evolution does not plan such a redirection. It modifies existing parts, step by step, while each intermediate form must still work well enough to survive. In cynodont, the jaw remains functional. The animal feeds, breathes, moves, and reproduces. Yet the architecture is changing in a way that later becomes one of the defining features of mammals. This hidden transformation continues while the world around them is still recovering from catastrophe. The small survivor in a burrow or under low vegetation carries in its bones a future no ecosystem could recognize. Their limbs and posture also suggest a gradual movement away from the sprawling stance of many earlier land vertebrates. The body becomes better suited to more efficient movement, with limbs held somewhat more beneath the torso in many forms. The rib cage, breathing, and body mechanics also change over time, and in later mammal relatives, these shifts will become tied to a more sustained metabolism. Metabolism is not fossilized directly, so it must be inferred cautiously from bone structure, growth patterns, nasal passage, posture, and ecological behavior. But cynodonts seem to occupy a region of transition where energy use, insulation, and activity may have been changing together. Some may have had hair or hair-like coverings, though direct evidence is limited and not evenly distributed across the group. If insulation was present in some forms, it would have helped retain body heat, especially for smaller animals. In a world of climatic extremes, burrows, nocturnal habits, and insulation could work together. The mammal line's future may have depended partly on becoming less exposed to the open surface world. Smallness itself becomes a form of protection. Large animals need large and steady supplies of food. They are more vulnerable when plant communities collapse, prey declines, or heat stress increases. Small cynodonts can survive on less. They can hide more easily. They can exploit insects, seeds, small animals, and scattered resources that would not sustain a giant. They can shelter in burrows, under roots, inside crevices, or in the shadowed spaces of recovering vegetation. A small body is not automatically safe, but after the Great Dying, it may offer flexibility where grandeur fails. The early Triassic rewards tolerance, opportunism, and the ability to endure unstable conditions. Cynodonts fit parts of that world. They remain present. That presence is enough. Evolution does not need a lineage to dominate every age. It only needs the lineage to continue until conditions change again. The cynodont story also shows that survival after mass extinction can be divided between ecological success and evolutionary consequence. Lystrosaurus is ecologically spectacular in many early Triassic communities because it becomes common across broad regions. Cynodonts are often less overwhelming in the record, but their descendants carry a deeper future. Some cynodont groups will diversify during the Triassic into herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores of varying sizes. Others will remain small and increasingly mammal-like. Over time, changes accumulate more precise teeth, stronger jaw muscles, secondary palates that allow breathing while chewing, more complex hearing structures, and perhaps more controlled body temperature. None of these features appears for the sake of a distant mammal. Each serves immediate survival in the animal that carries it. A secondary palate, for example, can separate the air passage from the mouth, allowing an animal to breathe while processing food. Better chewing can extract more energy. Better hearing can detect prey, predators, or social signals in dim environments. These are practical advantages in the present before they become markers of ancestry in the future. The damaged Triassic world may have helped shape this quiet path. Open niches existed after the extinction, but the largest opportunities were increasingly taken by diapsid reptiles and archosaur relatives. Cynodonts persisted in a landscape where they often did not control the top roles. That limitation may have encouraged smaller size, nocturnality, burrowing, flexible feeding, and sensory refinement. The evidence for nocturnal habits in early mammal relatives is partly inferential, based on later mammalian traits and the ecological pressures of living alongside larger reptiles, but the idea fits a broader pattern. A creature that cannot dominate the daylight open ground may become excellent in margins, twilight, leaf litter, burrow networks, undergrowth, and hidden roots between roots and stones. The great story of mammals may therefore begin not with victory, but with avoidance. Their ancestors endure by becoming difficult to erase, not by becoming impossible to challenge. This makes the cynodont line one of the most understated inheritances of the Great Dying. The extinction removes the old synapsid world, but not all synapsid possibility. It leaves behind forms that no longer hold the planet in the way their Permian relatives once did. Yet within them the synapsid body is being refined rather than abandoned. The skull becomes a place of future hearing. The teeth become more precise tools. The limbs become more efficient supports. The body may become warmer, more insulated, more active, more capable of feeding and breathing at the same time. These changes are intimate compared with the scale of volcanism, anoxia, and global extinction. They happen inside jaws and ribs, in the architecture of small bones, in habits that rarely fossilize directly. Yet deep time often turns on such small survivals. A planet can be remade by fire and poisoned seas, and still the decisive future may be carried in a creature small enough to vanish under a fallen branch. The cynodonts do not end the Triassic as the dominant animals of Earth. Many larger roles pass to reptile lineages. Archosaurs expand. Marine reptiles enter the seas. New predators and herbivores arise across recovering ecosystems. The mammal line remains restricted, persistent, and secondary. But secondary is not the same as insignificant. Beneath the age of reptiles, the mammalian inheritance continues to sharpen. True mammals will emerge later from within cynodont ancestry, still small at first, still living under the shadows of larger animals, but carrying the anatomical legacy formed through these long intervals of pressure. The Great Dying nearly ended the broader synapsid reign, yet it also forced the lineage into a narrower, more resilient channel. In that channel, the future changed shape. It no longer belonged to the saber-toothed rulers of the late Permian, or the bulky herbivores that filled the old landscapes. It belonged, quietly and without certainty, to small bodies that kept going. The next world will be filled more and more by reptiles, archosaurs, and experimental forms spreading into the openings left by extinction. But beneath that visible radiation, another story continues close to the ground. It is the story of a lineage that loses the world and preserves a future after the Great Dying. The open rolls of the land do not remain empty forever. They wait under heat, instability, and recovery until surviving lineages begin to test them again. Among the most consequential of those lineages are the diapsids, animals whose skulls carry two openings behind the eye and whose descendants will include lizards, snakes, crocodilians, birds, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and extinct branches. In the Permian, diapsids had lived largely in the shadow of synapsid dominance. Some were small, some were specialized, and some belonged to side branches that would never lead to modern reptiles. But the extinction changes the balance. The old synapsid rulers are gone or diminished. Many large herbivore and predator roles are vacant. Marine ecosystems have lost much of their earlier structure. Forests and river systems are rebuilding in altered form. The world does not invite easy expansion. because climate stress and ecological poverty remain severe, but it does offer space where the previous occupants have vanished. Into that space, diapsids begin one of the great adaptive radiations of Earth history, not as a sudden conquest, but as a series of experiments unfolding across the Triassic. Adaptive radiation occurs when a surviving group diversifies into many ways of living, often after competitors disappear or new habitats open. In the Triassic, the process is visible across land, fresh water, coastlines, and sea. Diapsid bodies explore climbing, swimming, armor, long necks, heavy herbivory, fast predation, gliding, and strange skull shapes. Some of these experiments become ancestral to later giants. Others are temporary, flourishing for a while in the recovering world and then vanishing before the Jurassic begins. This makes the Triassic feel less like a simple prelude to dinosaurs and more like a wide, unsettled workshop of reptile evolution. The extinction has not produced a clean new order. It has produced an ecological opening, and many lineages move through it at once. Archosaur relatives are among the most important. Archosaurs, the ruling reptiles in a broad sense, will eventually split into the lines leading toward crocodilians on one side and dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and birds on the other, early in the Triassic. However, the Archosaur world is not yet organized around those familiar outcomes. It is varied, experimental, and often dominated by groups that later disappear. Some Archosaur relatives become large predators with powerful jaws and deep skulls. Others become armored plant eaters. Others take to rivers and lakes. Their rise is partly a result of opportunity, but opportunity alone does not explain it. These animals also possess traits that help them operate effectively in the post-extinction world: efficient locomotion, adaptable feeding strategies, strong skull mechanics, and in some branches, a more upright posture than many earlier sprawling forms. A body that moves with the limbs held more beneath it can travel more efficiently, support greater size, and perhaps sustain more active behavior in a damaged landscape where food may be patchy and competition is reorganizing. Movement itself becomes a form of resilience. The crocodilian side of the Archosaur story is especially rich during the Triassic. Even though the animals involved are not crocodiles in the modern sense, Rauisuchians and related predators take over roles once held by Gorgonopsians and other Permian hunters. Some are large, high-skulled animals, built to dominate terrestrial food webs. They show that the predator niche did not remain empty for long, but the shape of predation changed. The old synapsid saber-toothed line was gone, and in its place rose reptiles with different skulls, posturas, and evolutionary futures. Their dominance is a reminder that mass extinction allows replacement by bodies built on different anatomical plans. A landscape once governed by mammal relatives now increasingly belongs to Archosaur relatives. The change is not immediate everywhere, and synapsids still persist. But the direction of power on land has shifted. Herbivory also changes form. Atosaurs, armored archosaurs with broad bodies and heavy plates, become common in many later Triassic ecosystems. Their armor gives them a strange resemblance to much later armored dinosaurs. Though they belong to a different branch, they are part of a recurring pattern in evolution. Similar ecological problems can produce broadly similar solutions in unrelated groups. A body that eats plants while living among large predators may benefit from armor, bulk, low feeding posture, and strong limbs. Other herbivorous reptiles follow different paths, from beaked forms to animals with unusual skulls and tooth arrangements. Meanwhile, surviving synapsid herbivores, including later dicynodonts, still hold important places in some ecosystems. The early and middle Triassic are therefore not a simple handover from synapsids to reptiles. They are a long overlap, a contested recovery in which old lineages and new radiations share the same unstable ground. But over time, diapsids become more prominent, more diverse, and more capable of filling roles across the recovering world. Some reptiles move upward into trees and other complex habitats. Small climbing forms, including strange animals such as drepanosaurs in later Triassic ecosystems, show tails, limbs, and claws adapted for life among branches. Their bodies can look almost improbable, with narrow heads, grasping structures, and proportions unlike most familiar reptiles. Other forms, such as Longisquama, carry elongated structures that have drawn debate about display, gliding, or other functions, though their exact relationships and habits remain uncertain. Such animals matter because they show that recovery does not only produce new large predators and herbivores, it also restores vertical space, small niches, and specialized behaviors. A recovering ecosystem becomes more complex when creatures can live above the ground, in burrows, along trunks, beside rivers, and in the canopy. Each new way of living adds another layer to the world that had been flattened by extinction. The water offers still more openings. In rivers and coastal zones, phytosaurs develop long, narrow snouts and aquatic habits that resemble those of modern crocodilians. Though they are not true crocodiles, their nostrils sit far back on the skull near the eyes, giving them a distinctive design for ambush in water. They show how quickly certain ecological roles can be reinvented after disaster. A long snout lined with teeth is useful for seizing fish and small animals in aquatic settings, and evolution arrives at that form more than once. The Triassic world becomes filled with such convergences, where later observers may see familiar silhouettes attached to unfamiliar ancestry. The role may resemble a modern crocodile, a later dinosaur, or a mammalian predator, while the lineage behind it tells a different story. In the oceans, diapsids make an even more dramatic return to water. The Great Dying has devastated marine ecosystems, leaving openings for new predators in seas that are slowly rebuilding. Ichthyosaurs appear early in the Triassic and rapidly become among the most remarkable marine reptiles. Their bodies streamline over time into forms suited for open water swimming, with powerful tails, large eyes in some species, and diets that include fish and cephalopods. They are not fish, and not mammals, but reptiles reshaped by the sea until their outlines echo later dolphins and fast predatory fish. Nothosaurs and related marine reptiles explore another route, often with long necks, paddle-like limbs, and bodies suited to coastal hunting. These animals reveal how completely the post-extinction world opened marine roles. The old Paleozoic seas, rich with trilobites, brachiopod beds, crinoid meadows, and older reef systems, are gone. Into the recovering Mesozoic seas come new swimmers, new hunters, and new structures of predation. The ocean does not recover by restoring its former inhabitants. It recovers by allowing different bodies to occupy the space left behind. This reptile expansion eventually includes the earliest dinosaurs and pterosaurs, though at first they are not the only or always the dominant players. Early dinosaurs begin as relatively small members of a broader archosaur radiation, sharing ecosystems with many other reptile groups. Pterosaurs take vertebrate life into powered flight, adding a new dimension to Triassic and later Mesozoic ecosystems. But the familiar grandeur of the later Mesozoic is still forming. The Triassic remains experimental, crowded with lineages that will not all endure. Its importance lies in this uncertainty. The future is being assembled from survivors, but no single branch yet owns it completely. The dominance of dinosaurs will become clearer only after another extinction at the end of the Triassic removes many competitors and opens further space. For now, the post-Permian world belongs to radiation itself, to the widening of possibilities after the narrowest survival. The rise of reptiles after the Great Dying is therefore not a simple victory story. It is a consequence of devastation, recovery, and chance. Diapsids expand because they survive, because competitors vanish, because their bodies can be modified into many ecological roles, and because the Triassic environment rewards certain forms of mobility, feeding, protection, and tolerance. Their radiation fills the land and sea with new designs, but it also confirms the cost of the extinction. These new animals do not continue the Paleozoic world. They replace it with something different. The synapsid age of the Permian gives way to a reptile-dominated Mesozoic, while the mammal line remains small and persistent in the background. Ruin has become opportunity, but only for those that pass through the ruin alive. Across the recovering planet, armored bodies move through dry basins. Long snouts wait in rivers. Marine reptiles cut through damaged seas, and early archosaurs begin to hint at later empires. The world is no longer empty. It is reorganizing, and in that reorganization, the long shadow of the Great Dying becomes visible not only in what disappeared, but in every new form that rises because the old order could not return. Recovery after the Great Dying is not a return to the world that existed before it. It is the construction of a different biosphere from the few surviving materials left behind. For millions of years after the boundary, Earth remains unstable enough that life advances unevenly, gaining complexity in one region while remaining simplified in another. Rebuilding a marine community here while a nearby basin still carries the marks of low oxygen and chemical stress. The old Paleozoic order, with its trilobite seafloors, brachiopod richness, reef structures, and synapsid rulers, does not come back. It has crossed a threshold from which restoration is no longer possible. What follows is not healing in the sense of reversal. It is healing in the sense that living systems begin to work again, but with new bodies, new balances, and new vulnerabilities. The early Mesozoic world grows from absence as much as from survival. Empty ecological roles become invitations, but only after climate, ocean chemistry, soils, forests, and food webs become stable enough for those roles to matter. This is why the recovery seems slow compared with the scale of the opportunity. Extinction has opened space, but the space itself is damaged. Before the world can become diverse again, it has to become habitable again. In the seas, that process is especially delayed. Reef ecosystems, which once gave shallow marine life much of its structure, take a long time to regain large and complex forms. Shell builders return, but not immediately in the older Paleozoic richness. Ammonoids, reduced to a narrow remnant, diversify again with remarkable speed in some intervals, showing how a bottlenecked lineage can become expansive when conditions permit. Bivalves and gastropods become increasingly important in many Mesozoic marine ecosystems, while brachiopods never regain the same dominance they held before the crisis. This shift is one of the major consequences of the extinction. The sea does not simply refill with the same kinds of animals. Its center of gravity moves. Groups once secondary become more prominent. The evolutionary balance among shellfish changes. Predation, burrowing, grazing, and reef building all resume. But the patterns differ from those of the Paleozoic. The ocean after the Great Dying is therefore a place of continuity and replacement at once. Some ancient lineages persist, but the vanished ones leave spaces that are occupied by different designs. The long recovery of reefs shows how hard it is to rebuild ecological architecture once its builders and conditions have been removed together. On land, the consequences are just as deep. Synapsids survive, but their age of open dominance is over. Dicynodonts remain important for much of the Triassic, and cynodonts preserve the line that will lead toward mammals. Yet the largest and most visible expansions increasingly belong to diapsid reptiles and archosaurs. The rise of the reptile-dominated Mesozoic is not inevitable from the beginning of the Permian. It becomes possible because the end-Permian extinction breaks the older terrestrial order. Without that rupture, the evolutionary opportunities that later allow archosaurs, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and marine reptiles to expand would have been shaped by a very different landscape of competitors and predators. The Great Dying does not create dinosaurs directly, and it does not aim toward them, but it rearranges the board on which their distant rise becomes possible. It removes many mammal relative rulers and clears ecological space that other lineages eventually enter. In this way, catastrophe becomes part of origin, not because destruction is creative by itself, but because survival after destruction changes which paths remain open. This is one of the most difficult lessons of mass extinction. It is both loss and selection, both ending and redirection. The slow pace of recovery also reveals that biological complexity depends on more than the presence of survivors. A few animals and plants can keep life going, but rich ecosystems require layered interactions. Plants need soils that can hold nutrients and water. Herbivores need dependable vegetation across seasons. Predators need enough prey to raise young. Rivers need stable banks. Marine animals need oxygenated water and chemical conditions that allow shells, skeletons, and larvae to form. Reefs need builders, grazers, clear water, and time. The Great Dying damages these supports together, so the return of diversity is delayed by the weakness of the surrounding system. This makes the extinction different from a simple pruning of branches. It cuts into the roots of ecological function. For a long time afterward, the survivors are not merely diversifying into emptiness. They are living inside a planet still recovering its capacity to support complexity. Heat waves, ocean anoxia, unstable carbon cycling, and repeated environmental stress may have prolonged the early Triassic hardship. The world is trying to become generous again. But generosity in nature is a system property, not a mood. It must be rebuilt through weathering, regrowth, circulation, burial, evolution, and time. Yet life does widen again. This widening is not smooth, and it is never guaranteed, but it is persist. Plants re-establish more stable communities. Soils deepen. Rivers become less erratic as vegetation returns. Marine animals churn sediments more fully where oxygen permits. Reefs eventually reappear in more complex forms. Predators diversify. Prey respond. And the arms of ecological relationship begin to lengthen again. In the Triassic, the world becomes increasingly filled with new experiments. Archosaurs on land, reptiles in the sea, flying pterosaurs above the ground, cynodonts in smaller roles, amphibians persisting in water-linked habitats, and plants forming the green background of recovery. The planet is not healed into the past. It is growing into the future. By the time the Mesozoic becomes fully established, the effects of the end-Permian crisis are embedded in nearly everything. The absence of trilobites is permanent. The reduced role of brachiopods is permanent. The end of gorgonopsians is permanent. The shift from synapsid-dominated land faunas toward reptile and archosaur prominence is one of the great historical turns in vertebrate evolution. Even the later rise of mammals, long delayed under reptile-dominated ecosystems, carries the shape of this earlier narrowing. Mammals come not from the mighty synapsid rulers that stood before the extinction, but from smaller survivors whose line endured in the background after their wider kin were diminished. The Great Dying also changes how Earth's history is understood. It shows that the planet's habitability is not a fixed gift, but a dynamic balance maintained by interactions among rock, air, water, and life. Volcanism is not separate from biology when volcanic gases can alter climate and ocean chemistry. Continents are not merely scenery when their arrangement changes rainfall, temperature, and habitats. Microbes are not background when their metabolism can expand in oxygen-poor seas. Plants are not passive greenery when their loss changes soils, rivers, carbon uptake, and food webs. The end-Permian crisis brings these connections into view with unusual force. It is a reminder that the biosphere is not independent from the planet beneath it. Life lives inside Earth's systems, and when those systems shift too far or too fast, even long successful forms can fail. The extinction's severity also gives survival a different meaning. Survival is often imagined as triumph, but after the Great Dying it is more precise to call it continuity under reduction. The survivors are not necessarily the strongest in any ordinary sense. They are the ones whose bodies, habits, location, and tolerances happen to remain possible as conditions close around others. Some endure because they are small, some because they reproduce quickly, some because they can burrow, eat varied foods, tolerate low oxygen, or pass through scattered refuges. Some survive by chance as much as by adaptation. From those uneven remnants, the future emerges. This does not make the losses less immense. It makes the continuity more fragile and more remarkable. Life does not pass through the great dying as an unstoppable force. It passes through as a narrowed flame, protected by accident, resilience, and the diversity that still remains after so much has been removed. In the longest view, the great dying becomes one of the hinges of Earth history. On one side lies the Paleozoic, with its ancient seas, early forests, and mammal relative rulers. On the other lies the Mesozoic, with reptiles expanding into land, ocean, and sky, and mammals beginning their long hidden preparation beneath larger shadows. The hinge is made of death, but also of transformation. It closes one world so thoroughly that the next cannot resemble it. The catastrophe is not redeemed by what follows, because extinction is real loss, and vanished lineages do not return simply because others later flourish. But the aftermath shows that life's history is not a straight ascent. It is a braided record of persistence after interruption, complexity after simplification, and new forms rising where older forms once seemed secure. The great dying nearly removed the living richness that had taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble. It left behind damaged seas, unstable landscapes, and a biological inheritance reduced to survivors. From that inheritance, Earth slowly rebuilt, not the same world, but another one. And the consequence of that rebuilding reaches all the way into the later history of dinosaurs, mammals, forests, reefs, and the living planet that eventually learns to read the boundary in stone. The story of the great dying ends without a final image of completion, because recovery in deep time is never a door closing behind disaster. It is a slow widening after a long narrowing, a patient return of connection among air, water, stone, plant, microbe, and animal. The old Paleozoic world does not rise again. Its trilobites remain gone. Its synapsid empires remain broken. Its reefs and forests return only through different forms and different balances. Yet life continues, not untouched, not triumphant in any simple way, but persist. In the damaged quiet after the extinction, a few lineages hold open the future. Some are common for a time and then fade. Some remain small and nearly hidden. Some enter empty seas, open rivers, recovering forests, and unstable plains, carrying the first outlines of worlds that will come much later. The great dying leaves a lesson shaped less like warning than like perspective. Earth is powerful, but not gentle. Life is resilient, but not invulnerable. Complexity can grow across immense time and still depend on conditions narrow enough to fail. What remains after such a crisis is not proof that loss does not matter. It is proof that continuity can survive even when abundance cannot. The rocks keep the boundary quietly, layer over layer, holding the memory of vanished oceans and poisoned skies without grief, without urgency, and without explanation beyond the evidence they contain. From that evidence, a living planet becomes visible as something both enduring and delicate, built through connection, altered through disturbance, and always shaped by what survives. The world that followed was not the same world. It was simply the one that could begin again.